The fire that eventually consumed the Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Blackwood started with a low, rhythmic thrum that Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vance recognized as the sound of a failing generator. 3 minutes before the first mortar landed, and everyone began treating her like a casualty, instead of the only person who knew the way out. She sat in the dim, blue-tinted light of the GeoInt booth, her fingers hovering over a worn trackball, watching a thermal feed from a Reaper drone orbiting 10,000 feet above the Sorobai Valley. To anyone else in the room, the screen showed nothing but the cooling grayscale of the high desert at 0300. To Elena, the screen showed a lie. She saw the way the heat bloom from a cluster of rocks near the eastern perimeter wasn't dissipating at the rate it should have, suggesting something hollow and occupied beneath the shale. She didn't look up when the door to the windowless room hissed open. She didn't need to. She knew the gait of Major Sterling by the heavy, impatient strike of his heels on the raised floor panels. Sterling was a man who believed the world was exactly what was printed on the morning sitrep, and Elena Vance was, in his estimation, a high-functioning piece of office equipment. Elena had grown up in the Hocking Hills of Ohio, a place where the earth was folded into deep, limestone puzzles, and the woods were thick enough to swallow a person whole if they didn't know how to read the lean of the trees. Her father had been a land surveyor for the county, a man who spoke in degrees and minutes, who taught her that the land never lied but people often did. By the time she was 12, she could walk into a 500-acre plot of timber and come back with a hand-drawn map that was accurate to within a yard. It wasn't a talent, it was a sensory immersion. She didn't just see the terrain. She understood the pressure of it, the way water wanted to move, the way a trail would naturally curve to avoid a soft patch of clay. When she joined the army, the recruiters saw her test scores and tried to shove her into a box, but she chose geospatial intelligence because she wanted to see the things no one else was looking for. She had spent 15 years staring at the world through a straw, learning the specific visual grammar of conflict zones from the Balkans to the Horn of Africa. At FOB Blackwood, she was the map lady. It was a title given with a shrug by the Rangers and the Green Berets who cycled through the wire, men who respected the intelligence but rarely the person who distilled it. She was 42, her hair pulled into a bun so tight it felt like it was holding her skull together, and she had a way of looking through people that made them uncomfortable. She didn't participate in the communal griping over the lukewarm mess hall Salisbury steak or the lack of reliable Wi-Fi. She worked 18-hour shifts in a room that smelled of ozone and stale coffee, her eyes tracing the digital veins of a landscape that felt more real to her than the plywood walls of her CHU. She had a habit of clicking a heavy brass Zippo, a gift from her father, open and shut, whenever she was processing a discrepancy. It was the only sound she made when she was thinking, a metallic heartbeat in the silence of the TOC. Vance, Sterling said, his voice cutting through the hum of the cooling fans. I need the terrain overlays for the 75 THs push into the North Ravine. They are moving at 0500. I want the updated high-res on my tablet 5 minutes ago. Elena didn't turn her head. Her eyes were fixed on that cluster of rocks on the thermal feed. The shadow was wrong. It wasn't the jagged, chaotic shadow of natural erosion. It was too straight, too deliberate. The North Ravine is a diversion, Major, she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the inflection that usually signals an opinion. She stated it as if she were reading the barometric pressure. The heat signatures near the eastern gate aren't rocks. They are vents. There's an infiltration tunnel being cleared. They've been working on it for 6 days. If you send the 75th into the ravine, you're leaving the rear of the base open to a subterranean breach. Sterling stepped closer, the smell of his expensive cedarwood aftershave clashing with the industrial scent of the room. He leaned over her shoulder, his shadow falling across her monitors. The SIGINT guys haven't picked up a whisper of tunnel chatter, Vance. The satellites show clear ground. You're looking at shadows and telling me the sky is falling. Give me the overlays for the ravine. That's an order. Elena felt the familiar, cold pressure of controlled rage tightening in her chest. It wasn't the rage of someone who felt insulted. It was the rage of a professional watching a disaster being meticulously assembled by an amateur. She reached into the cargo pocket of her OCP trousers and pulled out a ruggedized, waterproof map case. Inside was a physical sheet of Mylar, hand-annotated in fine-point permanent marker. It was a map she had been building since she arrived at Blackwood 3 months ago. It contained everything the digital systems missed. The seasonal dry creek beds that didn't show on the 2018 surveys, the ancient goat paths that provided natural cover from overhead surveillance, and the specific minute changes in the soil color that indicated recent excavation. It was her secret map, a document of the ground's true face that she never shared because she knew they wouldn't understand the language it was written in. "Sir," she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming the quiet, dangerous sound of a specialized tool being misused. "The satellites have a refresh rate of 24 hours for this sector. The SIGINT guys are listening for radios, but these people use runners. I'm not looking at shadows. I'm looking at the displacement of 300 cubic meters of earth that wasn't there last Tuesday. The ravine is a dry hole. The threat is under our feet." Sterling huffed, a sound of dismissive amusement. He saw a middle-aged woman in a windowless room, a technician who spent too much time in the dark. He didn't see the woman who had once spent 48 hours in a hide site in the Hindu Kush, identifying a high-value target by the specific way he walked across a courtyard. "This is why you're in the booth and not in the field, Vance. You get tunnel vision. You see a pattern and you fall in love with it. I don't have time for a GeoInt ghost story. Get me the ravine data, now." He turned on his heel and walked out, the heavy door thudding shut behind him. Elena sat in the silence, the trackball cool under her palm. She didn't feel the need to argue further. She had presented the truth. It wasn't her fault the recipient was blind. She reached for the Zippo. Asterisk, click-clack. Click-clack. Asterisk, her mind began to run the numbers. If the breach happened at the eastern gate, the primary fuel bladder would be the first thing to go. The fire would sweep through the TOC because of the way the ventilation was rigged. The main evacuation route would be cut off by the collapse of the secondary guard tower. The base was a trap, and she was sitting in the middle of it. She stood up, her movements precise and unhurried. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't grab her laptop. She took the map case and slid it into the front of her plate carrier against her ribs where she could feel the hard edge of it. She grabbed her M4 from the rack, checked the chamber, and felt the weight of the 3 spare magazines in her pouch. She wasn't supposed to be armed in the TOC, but Elena Vance had long ago stopped following rules that didn't contribute to the mission. She looked at the clock on the wall. 0345. She walked out of the booth and into the main floor of the TOC. It was a hive of activity. Dozens of analysts and officers were prepping for the morning push. There was a sense of purpose in the air, a collective belief in the plan. No one looked at her. She was just another support staffer moving through the periphery. She passed the comms desk, where a young corporal named Miller was nursing a rippet and staring blankly at a radio console. Miller was 21, from a town in Indiana that probably looked a lot like hers. He was the only one who ever asked her if she needed anything. "You okay, Chief?" Miller asked, squinting at her through the haze of blue light. "You look like you're heading for a fight." "Check your secondary frequencies, Miller," she said, her voice low. "The low-band stuff. If you hear rhythmic tapping, it's not interference. It's a signal. Get your gear ready. Don't wait for the alarm." Miller blinked, his brow furrowing. "The alarm? What are you?" He was cut off by the sound she had predicted. The generator thrummed, a jagged mechanical cough that vibrated through the floorboards. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the world exploded. The first mortar didn't hit the perimeter. It hit the power station. The TOC went black for a heartbeat before the emergency red lights kicked in, casting the room in a bloody, strobe-like glare. The sound was a physical blow, a pressure wave that shattered the thin plywood partitions and sent glass spraying across the floor. Screams followed, but they were distant, muffled by the ringing in Elena's ears. She didn't dive for cover. She stood still, her body absorbing the shock, her mind already navigating the map she had memorized. "Incoming! Incoming!" Someone screamed. The voice was high, panicked. The second mortar hit the roof of the TOC. The ceiling joists groaned and buckled. A section of the HVAC ducting tore loose, swinging like a pendulum. Fire, bright and hungry, bloomed in the server racks behind her. The smell of burning plastic and chemical coolant filled the air, thick and acrid. Elena felt the heat on the back of her neck. She turned and saw the fire spreading with terrifying speed, fueled by the very cables that carried the data Sterling so desperately wanted. Through the smoke, she saw Sterling. He was on the floor, his face bloodied by a piece of flying debris, his eyes wide and vacant. He was the picture of a man whose reality had just been dismantled. He was looking at the flames, at the chaos, and he was paralyzed. He was a victim now, waiting for someone to tell him what the new procedure was. Elena moved. She didn't go for the door Sterling had used. She knew that hallway was already a chimney for the fire below. She went for the small, reinforced equipment hatch in the rear of the room, a door that led to a maintenance crawlspace no one used. She grabbed Corporal Miller by the back of his vest as she passed. He was frozen, his hands still clutching his headset. "With me," she said. "It wasn't a suggestion. We have to go out the front." Miller yelled, his voice cracking. "The SOP says—" "The SOP is currently on fire, Miller," Elena said. She shoved him toward the hatch. "Move." She looked back one last time. The TOC was a furnace. The digital maps were gone, the screens melted into black sludge. The institutional memory of FOB Blackwood was being erased in real time. She felt the weight of the map case against her ribs. It was the only thing left that knew the truth of the ground outside. She kicked the hatch open, the metal hot against her boot, and stepped into the dark, the smell of the desert and the sound of the fire chasing her as she disappeared into the narrow throat of the crawlspace. Outside, the base was a landscape of jagged orange light and shifting shadows. The ghost network she had seen on the thermal feed had vomited dozens of fighters into the heart of the compound. The eastern gate was gone, replaced by a crater and a wall of flame. The air was thick with the chatter of AK-47s and the heavier, rhythmic thud of a M2 Browning from one of the surviving guard towers. Elena and Miller spilled out of the maintenance vent into a narrow alley between two shipping containers. The ground was cold, the sand gritting under Elena's gloves as she pressed her back against the corrugated metal. She could hear the shouts of the insurgents, close, maybe 50 yards away. They were moving with precision, hitting the armory and the fuel depot first. They knew the layout of the base as well as she did. Miller was hyperventilating, his rifle shaking in his hands. "We're cut off. They're everywhere. We're gonna die here, Chief. We're just analysts. We're not supposed to be out here." Elena reached out and gripped the front of his vest, pulling him close until their foreheads almost touched. Her eyes were calm, 2 points of steady light in the chaos. "Look at me, Miller. Do you know where we are?" The base, Blackwood." "No," she said. "We're on the intersection of MGRS coordinates 42 SVF 882 to 914. There is a drainage pipe 60 meters to our west. It leads under the perimeter wire and into a dry wash. That wash is shadowed from the north tower. It's the only way out that isn't a kill zone. Do you understand?" Miller stared at her, his breathing slowing. He didn't understand the coordinates, but he understood the certainty in her voice. He saw a woman who wasn't reacting to the war. She was navigating it. "I have the map," Elena said, her hand dropping to the case against her ribs. "I know the way through the fire, but you have to move when I move. If you stop, you're a casualty. If you move, you're a soldier. Choose now." Miller swallowed hard, his knuckles white on his M4. "I'm moving, Chief." "Good." Elena peered around the edge of the shipping container. The fire from the fuel bladder had turned the center of the base into a hellscape of black smoke and roaring heat. She saw a group of American soldiers, Rangers by the look of their kit, pinned down behind a burning Humvee. They were being picked off one by a sniper positioned in the ruins of the mess hall. They were looking for a way forward, but the world they knew had been replaced by a nightmare of fire and lead. They thought the battle was a chaotic mess of chance and violence. They saw a disaster. Elena saw a path. She saw the timing of the sniper's shots. She saw the gap in the smoke where the wind from the valley was pushing the heat away. She saw the secret geometry of the terrain that would allow her to lead them out. She didn't wait for a command. She didn't wait for a radio call that would never come. She stepped out into the light of the burning base, the map case a hard, reassuring weight against her heart, and began to run toward the fire, the only person who knew that the fire was exactly where the exit was hidden. The heat was a physical barrier, a wall of shimmering air that distorted the world around them as Elena and Miller sprinted toward the burning fuel bladder. Every instinct Miller had screamed at him to turn back, to find a cool, dark corner and hide until the world stopped ending. But Elena Vance moved with a terrifying, singular purpose. She didn't zigzag or crouch in the way they taught in basic training. She moved in a straight, calculated line, her eyes scanning the ground for the subtle shifts in elevation that would provide even an inch of cover from the small arms fire snapping through the air. "Chief, the fire!" Miller yelled, his voice almost lost to the roar of the burning JP-8. "The fire is the only thing they can't see through." Elena shouted back, not slowing down. "Follow my boots." They dove behind a stack of concrete T-walls that had been pushed askew by a previous blast. The heat here was intense enough to blister the paint on the concrete. 10 yards away, the burning Humvee was a skeleton of white-hot metal. The Rangers were still pinned, their fire sporadic and desperate. One of them, a sergeant with a blood-soaked bandage around his thigh, looked up as Elena and Miller slid into the dirt beside him. "Who the hell are you?" the sergeant rasped, his eyes red-rimmed from the smoke. "Where's the QRF? Where's the air support?" "The air support is grounded by the smoke, and the QRF is currently fighting a breach at the main gate," Elena said, her voice cutting through the sergeant's panic like a scalpel. She didn't look at his wound. She looked at the mess hall ruins 300 yards away. "The sniper is in the second-story mechanical room. He's got a clear lane on you, but he's blind to the drainage ditch behind the fuel bladder." The sergeant laughed, a harsh, hacking sound. "The drainage ditch? That's a death trap, lady. The fire's gonna cook anyone who goes near it." "The fire is on the surface," Elena said. She reached into her map case and pulled out the Mylar sheet. She didn't show him the whole thing. She pointed to a specific hand-drawn blue line that deviated from the official base blueprints. "The drainage pipe was diverted 6 months ago during the monsoon season. It's 4 feet deep and runs under the burning zone. The water table has dropped, so it's dry. If we move now, we can get under the sniper's line of sight and come up behind the mess hall." The sergeant looked at the map, then at Elena. He saw the map lady from the TOC, a woman he'd probably walked past 100 times without a second thought. But he also saw the way she held her rifle, the way her eyes weren't searching for safety but for the next move. She wasn't asking for permission. She was providing a coordinate. "You're sure?" the sergeant asked. "I mapped the diversion myself while you were all at the gym," Elena said. "It's there. Or you can stay here and wait for the sniper to find his rhythm again. You have 10 seconds before the wind shifts the smoke and exposes this T-wall." The sergeant looked at his remaining 3 men. They were exhausted, terrified, and out of options. He looked back at Elena. "Lead the way, map lady." Elena didn't waste time with a nod. She waited for the next mortar to impact, a thunderous crump that shook the earth and sent a fresh plume of black soot into the air, and then she rose. She didn't run away from the flames. She ran toward the heart of the heat, toward the place where the earth seemed to be swallowing itself. They hit the edge of the fuel bladder's containment berm, the air so hot it felt like breathing glass. Elena dropped into a narrow, concrete-lined slit in the ground that was half buried in sand. She disappeared into the earth, and one by one, the Rangers and Miller followed her. Inside the pipe, the world narrowed to a circle of dim, orange light ahead, and the sound of their own frantic breathing. It was cramped, the air thick with the smell of old silt and scorched earth, but it was cool. The roar of the battle above became a muted, rhythmic thumping, like the heart of a dying giant. Elena led them with a steady, unerring pace, her hand occasionally brushing the wall of the pipe to confirm her position. She wasn't guessing. She was navigating a 3-dimensional grid she had built in her mind over months of quiet observation. "We're under the mess hall now," she whispered, her voice echoing in the confined space. "The pipe turns 90 degrees up ahead. There's a maintenance manhole that opens into the kitchen pantry. Miller, you and the sergeant take the right. The rest of you cover the rear. When we go up, we don't stop until we reach the tree line." "What about the sniper?" the sergeant asked, his voice hushed. "I'll take the sniper," Elena said. She didn't wait for his reaction. She reached the manhole cover, a heavy iron disc that should have been impossible to move. She braced her shoulders against the wall of the pipe and pushed with a slow, grinding strength that came from years of mountain hiking and the quiet discipline of someone who never let her body go soft. The cover groaned and shifted. She climbed out into the pantry, the air smelling of roasted coffee and burnt flour. The mess hall was a ruin, the roof partially collapsed, the tables overturned. Through the shattered windows, she could see the flickering orange light of the base. She moved through the kitchen like a shadow, her boots silent on the linoleum. She didn't look at the carnage. She looked at the stairs leading to the mechanical room. She reached the base of the stairs and paused. Above her, she heard the rhythmic asterisk crack-slide-click asterisk of a bolt-action rifle. The sniper was focused on the Humvee, waiting for the Rangers to show their heads. He was good. He was patient. But he was looking at the world through a scope, a narrow, 2-dimensional view that excluded everything else. Elena climbed the stairs, her movements a series of deliberate, silent steps. She didn't feel fear. She felt the dark competence, the narrowing of the universe until it consisted only of the target and the distance between them. She reached the door to the mechanical room. It was propped open with a fire extinguisher. She didn't shout. She didn't demand a surrender. She stepped into the room and fired 2 rounds into the center of the sniper's back before he could even turn his head. The suppressor on her M4 turned the shots into heavy metallic coughs. The man slumped over his rifle, his world ending in a blur of gray dust and sudden inexplicable weight. Elena walked to the window and looked out. From this vantage point, she could see the entire base. It was a disaster, yes. The TOC was a blackened shell. The main gate was a slaughterhouse, but she saw something else. She saw the way the insurgents were clustering, their movements becoming disorganized now that the initial shock had worn off. They were looting, not holding. They thought they had won because they had destroyed the buildings and the officers. They didn't realize that the intelligence of the base wasn't in the servers. It was in the woman standing in the ruins of the mess hall. She keyed her radio, switching to the emergency frequency Miller had been monitoring. "All stations, this is Vance. I am in the mess hall crow's nest. The sniper is down. The eastern breach is being reinforced by 10+ hostiles. I have a clear line of sight on their secondary tunnel exit. If you can hear my voice, adjust your fire to MGRS 42 SVF 883 to 912. The threat is not the gate. The threat is the tunnel." There was a long silence, filled only with the crackle of static and the distant sound of combat. And then a voice came through, cracked, weary, but alive. "Vance, this is Cross at the North Tower. We hear you. We thought the TOC was gone. We thought everyone was dead. The TOC is gone, Sergeant Cross," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the map in her mind, her hand already reaching for the Mylar sheet to confirm the next coordinate. "But I'm still here, and I can see everything. Get your guns on that coordinate. I'm going to walk you onto the target." She stood in the smoke and the fire, the victim they had ignored, the technician they had dismissed. She looked down at the secret map, the ink lines glowing in the orange light of the burning base. She wasn't a casualty. She was the ghost in the machine, the surveyor of the apocalypse, and she was just getting started. The air in the mechanical room was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the ozone of the dying base. Elena stood by the window, her silhouette a dark, jagged edge against the flickering firelight. Below her, the rangers she had led through the pipe were already moving, using the chaos she had created to flank the insurgents near the fuel depot. They were moving like soldiers again, their posture changed, their movements directed. They had a destination now. "Vance, this is Cross," the radio crackled. "We're on the coordinate, but we can't see the exit. It's all smoke and rubble down there. Trust the grid, Cross," Elena said, her voice a steady, rhythmic pulse. "The exit is behind the collapsed laundry facility. There's a red shipping container tilted at a 45-degree angle. The tunnel mouth is 3 meters to the left of the container's rear doors. They're using the container as a shield. Fire for effect, 3 rounds high explosive. Now." She watched as the North Tower's MK-19 grenade launcher began to thud, the heavy asterisk thump 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 asterisk echoing across the compound. A heartbeat later, the area near the red shipping container erupted in a series of bright, jagged blooms of orange and black. The container was tossed aside like a toy, and the earth beneath it buckled. She saw figures, dozens of them, scrambling out of the newly exposed hole, caught in the open, their ghost path turned into a mass grave. "Direct hit," Cross shouted over the radio, the professional detachment in his voice breaking into a moment of pure, raw triumph. "Goddamn, Vance, you actually saw it. You actually saw the whole thing." "Keep your eyes on the tree line, Cross," Elena said, already shifting her gaze. "They'll try to exfiltrate through the North Wash. I'm moving to the comms shed. I need to get a high-gain signal to the birds in the air. If the Reapers can't see through the smoke, I'll give them the coordinates manually." She turned and saw Corporal Miller standing in the doorway of the mechanical room. He was covered in soot, his uniform torn, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a new, burgeoning respect. He was looking at the dead sniper, then at the map case Elena was sliding back into her vest. "Chief," Miller said, his voice trembling. "Major Sterling. He didn't make it out of the TOC. I saw the roof come down." Elena paused, her hand on the doorframe. She felt a brief, cold flicker of something, not pity, not joy, just the acknowledgement of a cost paid. Sterling had died for a plan that didn't exist on the ground. He had died because he couldn't see the world past the edge of his own ego. "The Major made his choice, Miller," she said. "Now you make yours. Are you coming to the comms shed or are you staying here?" Miller didn't hesitate. He stepped over the sniper's legs and fell in behind her. "I'm with you." They descended the stairs, moving back into the heart of the inferno. The base was a labyrinth of smoke and shifting shadows. The fire had spread to the motor pool, and the sound of tires exploding sounded like a rhythmic execution. Elena moved through the chaos with the same eerie calm she had shown in the booth. She wasn't running, she was navigating. She knew where the heat would be most intense, where the structures were most likely to collapse, where the insurgents would be setting up their final defensive positions. They reached the comms shed, a small, reinforced concrete bunker on the western edge of the base. The door was locked, the electronic keypad melted. Elena didn't reach for a tool. She stepped back and fired 3 rounds into the door's hinges, then kicked it open with a brutal, efficient strike. Inside, the room was a tomb of silent technology. The primary arrays were dead, the cables severed by the same mortar that had hit the power station. But Elena wasn't looking for the primary arrays. She went to the back of the room, to a dusty, olive-drab box that hadn't been opened since the base was commissioned. It was an old-school, high-gain satellite burst transmitter, a piece of legacy gear that the modern analysts laughed at because it required a manual handshake and a physical antenna alignment. "Miller, get the hand-crank generator from the locker," she ordered. "I need 3 minutes of steady power. Can you do that?" "On it," Miller said, diving for the locker. Elena pulled a compass and a protractor from her kit. She didn't need a computer to tell her where the satellites were. She had the orbital paths memorized for this sector, a mental clock that tracked the movement of the birds across the sky. She stepped outside the shed, the air thick with the smell of burning rubber, and began to manually align the parabolic dish on the roof. She was standing on the roof, exposed, the firelight from the TOC illuminating her like a target. A burst of machine gun fire chipped the concrete at her feet, but she didn't flinch. She adjusted the dish 3 degrees to the north, then locked it down. "Power's up," Miller yelled from inside. Elena dropped back into the shed and began to type. She didn't send a distress signal. She didn't send a status report. She sent a data packet, a series of coordinates and elevation markers that she had distilled from her secret map. It was the key to the Sorobai Valley, a map of every tunnel, every hide site, every supply cache the insurgents had built over the last decade. She was giving the Air Force the one thing they had been missing, the ability to see what was hidden beneath the skin of the earth. Asterisk packet sent. Acknowledged. Asterisk she leaned back against the concrete wall, her chest heaving, the sweat stinging her eyes. For the first time since the generator had thrummed, she felt the weight of what she was doing. She felt the cost of being the only one who knew. "What was that?" Miller asked, his hand still on the generator crank. "What did you send?" "The truth," Elena said. The sound of the first A-10 Warthog arriving was a low, guttural growl that shook the very foundations of the shed. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a jet. It was the sound of a giant ripping a sheet of metal in half. The 30mm cannon opened up, a BRRRRRT that lasted 3 seconds, and erased an entire line of insurgent technicals near the perimeter. Elena walked to the door of the shed and looked out. The sky was beginning to turn a bruised, pre-dawn purple. The fire in the TOC was finally dying down, leaving behind a skeletal ruin of blackened beams. Through the smoke, she saw the shapes of the Rangers moving back toward the center of the base, their rifles held high. They were the victors, but they looked like ghosts. And then she saw it. A group of officers, led by a colonel she recognized from the high command briefings, was walking toward the ruins of the TOC. They were surrounded by a heavy security detail, their faces grim, their boots stepping carefully over the debris. They were looking for the survivors. They were looking for the victims. Elena stepped out of the comms shed, Miller trailing behind her like a faithful hound. She was a mess. Her uniform was scorched, her face was a mask of soot and dried blood, and her hair had escaped its bun, hanging in wild, gray-streaked strands around her face. She looked like a woman who had been dragged through the heart of a volcano. The colonel stopped when he saw her. He looked at her rank, then at her face. He saw the map case still clutched in her hand. "Chief Warrant Officer Vance?" the colonel asked, his voice full of a sudden, sharp uncertainty. "We were told the TOC was a total loss. We were told no one made it out." Elena didn't salute. She didn't stand at attention. She walked up to the colonel and handed him the map case. The mylar was charred at the edges, the ink smudged by sweat and smoke, but the lines were still there. The truth was still there. "The TOC is gone, sir," Elena said, her voice a quiet, unbreakable rasp. "But the mission is still on the ground. Everything you need to finish this is in that case." The colonel opened the case. He looked at the hand-drawn lines, the meticulous annotations, the ghost network that had been mapped out with the precision of a master surgeon. He looked at the coordinates of the tunnel they had just destroyed. He looked back at Elena, and for the first time in her career, she saw a man in a high-ranking uniform truly see her. He didn't see a map lady. He didn't see a technician. He saw the person who had held the base together with nothing but a piece of plastic and a terrifying hidden capability. "They told me you were a victim of the fire, Vance," the colonel whispered, his eyes scanning the map. Elena looked back at the ruins of the TOC, at the smoke rising into the cold morning air at the place where she had been dismissed and ignored. She felt the Zippo in her pocket, the cold weight of the brass. She felt the ache in her bones and the permanent loss of the woman she had been before the fire started. "I wasn't the victim, Colonel," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the silent, shattered base. "I was the fire." She turned and began to walk toward the med tent, her boots leaving a steady, rhythmic trail in the red dust of the Surobai Valley. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew the map by heart, and she knew exactly where she was going. The battle for FOB Blackwood was over, but the war for the ground was just beginning, and Elena Vance was the only one who knew the way through the dark. The flap of the triage tent hissed open, admitting a slice of the pre-dawn light that was the color of a fresh bruise, and for the first time in 6 hours, Elena Vance felt the temperature of her own skin. It was cold, a clammy, graveyard chill that the adrenaline had been masking, and as the medic's scissors began to chew through the charred sleeve of her OCP blouse, she didn't watch the blood. She watched the way the dust motes danced in the beam of a single maglite, tracking the invisible air currents of the tent. Even here, under the smell of isopropyl alcohol and Coban wrap, her mind was calculating the draft, the structural integrity of the canvas, the way the ground sloped 3 degrees toward the north. The medic, a boy with rays stenciled on his chest and eyes that had seen too much of the last hour, was talking to her, but his voice was a distant radio signal fading into the static. The silence of the med tent was a lie. Outside, the base was screaming. The rhythmic asterisk thud-thud-thump asterisk of heavy machinery moving debris echoed off the surrounding ridges, and every few minutes, the sharp, authoritative asterisk crack asterisk of a controlled detonation rippled through the valley. They were clearing the victory now, sanitizing the disaster, and Elena could feel the institution already beginning to reset itself around her like a broken bone. She sat on the edge of the cot, her spine a rigid line of defiance against the exhaustion that wanted to collapse her lungs. She held the brass Zippo in her left hand, her thumb tracing the jagged scar on its casing, and waited for the moment the gratitude turned into a deposition. It took exactly 42 minutes. The man who entered the tent didn't wear a medic's cross. He wore the rank of lieutenant colonel and the crisp, unblemished uniform of someone who had spent the battle in an air-conditioned command center 60 miles away at Bagram. He was followed by a woman in civilian clothes, a senior analyst from an agency that didn't officially exist on the base's manifest. They didn't look at Elena's bandaged arm or the soot etched into the lines of her face. They looked at the Mylar map case she had placed on the small metal table beside her. "Chief Vance," the colonel said, his voice a practiced blend of concern and authority. "I'm Colonel Gathers. This is Miss Aris from JSOC. We've been briefed on your unconventional navigation of the breach. The Rangers speak very highly of your situational awareness." Elena didn't blink. She didn't offer a "thank you, sir." She watched Aris, who was already reaching for the map case with the delicate, predatory grace of a collector. "The map is proprietary, Colonel," Elena said. Her voice was a dry rasp, the sound of wind over shale. "It contains data that isn't on the official server, because the official server was wrong." Aris paused, her fingers an inch from the plastic. She looked at Elena, and for a second the two women shared a silent, icy recognition. Aris was a consumer of truths. Elena was a producer of them. "We're more interested in how you acquired this data, Chief," Aris said. "Your GeoInt logs show that you were accessing seismic sensors and agricultural soil surveys from the 1970s. That's a significant deviation from your assigned tasking." "The assigned tasking was to watch the ravine," Elena said, her thumb clicking the Zippo open. Asterisk click. Asterisk, the ravine was a movie set. The real stage was under the eastern perimeter. If I hadn't looked at the soil surveys, I wouldn't have known about the karst limestone pockets. If I hadn't watched the seismic logs, I wouldn't have seen the rhythmic displacement that indicated a boring machine. "A boring machine," Gathers said, his lip curling slightly. "The insurgents in this valley use shovels and pickaxes, Vance." We don't have intelligence suggesting they have the technical capability or the logistics to move heavy tunnel equipment into this sector. They didn't move it in, Elena said. She stood up, the movement slow and painful. She walked to the table and flipped open the map case. She pointed to a series of jagged, hand-drawn lines that radiated away from the destroyed tunnel. They didn't bring a machine. They repurposed the old Soviet irrigation pumps from the valley floor. They've been using water pressure to erode the limestone. It's not a tunnel. It's a hydraulic breach, and the one we hit tonight, that was just the pilot hole. The tent went silent, the only sound the distant, high-pitched whine of a drone returning to its nest. Gathers looked at Aris. Aris looked at the map. Elena could see the wheels turning. The institutional instinct to categorize this as outlier data, or stress-induced speculation. If they admitted she was right, they had to admit that every cleared sector in the Sorobai Valley was currently sitting on a honeycomb of potential collapse. It was easier, safer, to believe she was a gifted technician who had gotten lucky during a trauma. "We'll take the map for analysis, Chief," Gathers said, his tone shifting to the dismissive finality of a man who had a report to write. "You've been through a lot. The medical transport will have you out of here by 0900. You're being sent back to Landstuhl for a full evaluation. You've earned the rest. The 3rd Battalion is moving into the lower valley at 1200, Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming the quiet, dangerous sound of a specialized tool being misused. "If you send them in without checking the water table near the old dam, you're sending them into a sinkhole. The insurgents aren't going to fight them. They're going to drown them." Gathers didn't answer. He picked up the map case, tucked it under his arm, and nodded to Aris. "Get some sleep, Vance. That's an order." They left the tent, the hiss of the flap sounding like a finality. Elena stood alone in the dim light, her hands shaking, not with fear, but with the cold, vibrating pressure of a truth that no one wanted to buy. She felt the system closing its doors, the paperwork already being filed that would minimize her role, the map lady being packed away so the professionals could resume their orderly, doomed progression toward the next disaster. She walked out of the tent 5 minutes later. The morning was cold, the air tasting of cordite and the metallic tang of the burn pits. She found Miller sitting on the bumper of a scorched LMTV, a cup of coffee held in his trembling hands. He looked up when he saw her, his face a map of bruises and exhaustion. He didn't ask how she was. He saw the empty hands where the map case should have been. "They took it, didn't they?" Miller asked. Elena leaned against the cold metal of the truck, her eyes scanning the ridgeline. "They took the paper. They can't take the ground, Miller. Did you get the secondary radio from the comm shed?" Miller nodded, reaching into his cargo pocket and pulling out a ruggedized handheld unit. He had risked a court-martial to go back into the ruins for her, a small, quiet act of loyalty that outweighed every medal Gathers would ever hand out. "I also got this," he whispered, sliding a small, encrypted thumb drive toward her. "It's the raw seismic data from the last hour of the talks logs. I grabbed the backup drive before the fire hit the server rack. I didn't tell the CID guys. I didn't tell anyone." Elena took the drive, her fingers brushing Miller's. It was a cold, hard piece of plastic, but to her, it felt like a weapon. "Why, Miller? You could have stayed clean. You could have been the hero who helped the map lady and then went back to your desk." Miller looked at her, his eyes steady for the first time since the mortar hit. "Because you were the only one who knew the way out of the pipe, Chief, and I think we're still in the pipe." Elena felt a brief, sharp pang of something that might have been affection if she weren't so controlled. She nodded once, a sharp, professional acknowledgement. "Go to the motor pool, find a vehicle that's still operational, something with a high-clearance suspension. Don't check it out, just find it." "Where are we going?" "We're going to the old dam," Elena said, "before the 3rd Battalion hits the valley floor." The institutional failure was a quiet, grinding sound, like a gear with a missing tooth. As Elena moved through the base toward the motor pool, she saw it everywhere. She saw it in the way the new officers were pointing at digital maps on tablets that were already 30 minutes out of date. She saw it in the way the QRF was being briefed on conventional insurgent tactics, while the ground beneath their feet was being systematically hollowed out. The military was a machine designed for the last war, a beast that moved in straight lines and spoke in loud, confident voices. It had no language for the woman who saw the world in shades of limestone and water pressure. She reached the motor pool, a graveyard of twisted metal and oil-slicked sand. Miller was waiting by a ruggedized Polaris MRZR, a lightweight open-frame vehicle that looked like a skeletal insect. He had already loaded it with 2 extra cans of fuel and a crate of MREs. He was a comms tech, a kid from Indiana who should have been worrying about his Wi-Fi signal, but he was standing there with an M4 slung over his shoulder, waiting for a woman who was officially non-operational. "Chief," a voice called out from the shadows of a maintenance bay. Elena turned, her hand going to the grip of her holstered pistol. It was the ranger sergeant from the Humvee, the one whose leg she hadn't bothered to look at. He was walking with a heavy limp, his thigh wrapped in a fresh bandage, but his eyes were clear. He was holding a heavy, long-range optic, a thermal scope meant for a sniper rifle. "I heard they're shipping you out on the 0900, the sergeant said. He didn't ask why she was standing next to a stolen MRZR. He didn't ask about the thumb drive. He just held out the scope. "This thing has a better refresh rate than the drone feeds. It can pick up a heat signature through 6 feet of loose soil. You might need it where you're going." "Why are you giving me this, Sergeant?" Elena asked. The man looked at the smoking ruins of the TOC, then back at Elena. "Because you were right about the tunnel, and because Gathers is a prick who thinks a valley is just a shape on a screen. If you're going out there to prove him wrong, I want you to have the best eyes possible. Don't come back without a win, Vance." "I'm not looking for a win," Elena said, taking the scope. "I'm looking for the ground." She climbed into the passenger seat of the MRZR. Miller took the wheel, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering column. They didn't have a mission. They didn't have authorization. They were 2 people moving against the grain of an empire that had already decided they were irrelevant. "Exit through the western trash gate," Elena said. "The sensors there are fried from the blast. We have 4 minutes before the satellite pass. If we aren't in the shadow of the ridge by then, they'll pick up our heat signature." "What if we get caught?" Miller asked, the engine of the MRZR coughing to life with a low, throaty growl. "Then we'll be the most accurate casualties in the history of the Surobi Valley," Elena said. They moved out, the vehicle bouncing over the uneven terrain, the dust rising in a choking cloud behind them. As they cleared the perimeter wire, Elena looked back at FOB Blackwood. It looked small from here, a tiny, fragile island of plywood and hubris in a sea of ancient, unforgiving earth. She turned her gaze forward, toward the jagged peaks of the mountains that held the secrets she had been mapping in the dark. The drive was a brutal, bone-jarring 3 hours through the dead zones of the valley floor. Elena didn't use a GPS. She used the lean of the land. She directed Miller through dry creek beds that didn't appear on any modern survey, navigating by the specific color of the rocks and the way the wind moved through the canyons. She was looking for the breathing. "Stop!" she said, when they were 5 miles from the old Soviet dam. The silence that followed the engine's cut was absolute. The valley was a cathedral of stone and heat. Elena climbed out, her boots crunching on the brittle, sun-bleached soil. She took the thermal scope the ranger had given her and began to sweep the horizon. At first there was nothing, just the shimmering heat haze of the high desert. But then she saw it. Near the base of the dam, the earth wasn't solid. In the thermal spectrum, it was a pulsing, rhythmic blue, the color of cold water moving beneath the surface. It wasn't a natural flow. It was a sequence. The water was being pulsed through the limestone, a rhythmic hammering that was vibrating through the entire valley floor. It was a seismic weapon, a low-tech way to liquefy the soil under the very road the 3rd Battalion was currently preparing to traverse. "Miller," she whispered, her eyes still glued to the scope. "Connect the handheld to the thumb drive. I need you to run the seismic data through the filter I built on the TOC server. Look for a 4 Hz frequency." Miller scrambled to comply, his fingers flying over the keypad. The small screen on the radio flickered, a jagged green line appearing in the darkness. "I've got it, Chief. It's constant. It's like a heartbeat." "It's not a heartbeat," Elena said, her voice turning cold. "It's a countdown. They're liquefying the shelf. When the weight of the battalion's strikers hits that road, the whole valley floor is going to drop 50 feet into the karst. They won't even have to fire a shot." "We have to call it in," Miller said, his voice rising in panic. "We have to tell Gathers." "Gathers won't listen to a radio call from a stolen vehicle," Elena said. She looked at the dam, then at the ridgeline where she knew the insurgents were watching. "He needs to see it. He needs a visual that he can't ignore." She looked at the MRZR, then at the crate of MREs. She remembered the controlled detonations back at the base. She remembered the way the earth moved when you pushed it in the right place. "Miller, how much fuel do we have left in those cans?" 10 gallons, maybe 12. "Why?" "Because we're not going to call the 3rd Battalion." Elena said, her eyes narrowing as she fixed on a specific point on the dam's support structure. "We're going to give them a reason to stop. We're going to break the ground before they get here." She sat back in the sand, the heat of the day beginning to press down on her, the map lady finally stepping off the page and into the reality of the dirt. She felt the fear now, the real fear, the kind that lived in the marrow of her bones, but beneath it she felt the dark competence of a woman who knew exactly how much pressure it took to break a world. "Chief," Miller said, his voice quiet, "if we do this, if we blow that support, we're not just going to be non-operational. We're going to be enemy combatants in the eyes of the JAG." Elena looked at him, and for a fleeting moment she let the control slip. She let him see the cost of the last 20 years, the missed holidays, the failed relationships, the way she could only feel real when she was staring at a thermal feed. She let him see the woman who had spent her life being right and being punished for it. "I've spent 15 years drawing the world for people who won't look at it, Miller," she said. "For once, I'm going to make them feel it." She stood up, the Zippo clicking shut in her hand with a final, metallic asterisk snap asterisk. She didn't look at the map Case Gathers had taken. She didn't look at the medals she wouldn't get. She looked at the dam, the limestone, and the water, and she began to plan the destruction of the only thing she had ever truly loved: the ground. The institutional failure wasn't just a lack of intelligence. It was a lack of imagination. The men in the air-conditioned rooms couldn't imagine a war that didn't involve a visible enemy. They couldn't imagine a battlefield that was alive and angry. Elena Vance could. She could hear the valley breathing, and she knew that the only way to save the men who had dismissed her was to become the monster they thought she was. They worked through the heat of the afternoon, the sun a relentless hammer against the anvil of the valley. Elena directed Miller with the precision of a master mason, showing him where to wedge the fuel cans into the fissures of the dam's crumbling concrete. They weren't just using explosives. They were using the water's own pressure against itself. She was creating a stress fracture in the architecture of the insurgency's plan. Every movement was a struggle. Her bandaged arm throbbed with a dull, rhythmic pain that matched the vibration of the water. The soot was caked into her pores, and her tongue felt like a piece of dry leather in her mouth. But she didn't stop. She moved with a dark competence, her hands sure and steady as she rigged the detonator from the secondary radio's battery. "It's ready," Miller said, wiping the sweat from his eyes. He looked at the rigged charges, then at the horizon. "The 3rd Battalion is 30 minutes out from the entry point. I can hear their comms. They're moving fast, Chief. They think the road is clear." Elena took the thermal scope and looked one last time. The blue pulse was faster now, more urgent. The ground was reaching its saturation point. In 10 minutes, the road wouldn't be a road anymore. It would be a trap door. She looked at Miller, the boy who had followed her into the dark. "Get in the vehicle. Head for the high ground on the eastern ridge. Don't stop until you're above the 500-meter line." "What about you?" "I have to time the surge," Elena said. "If I blow it too early, the water will just dissipate. If I blow it too late, the lead striker will already be on the shelf. I have to wait for the first vibration." Miller hesitated, his hand on the frame of the MRZR. "Elena, if you don't make it to the ridge—" "The map is in your head now, Miller," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "You know where the karst is. You know how the water moves. Don't let them tell you it's a shadow." Miller nodded, his throat working as he swallowed back the protest. He climbed into the driver's seat and gunned the engine. He didn't look back as he drove away, the dust of his departure a fading signal in the twilight. Elena sat by the dam, the detonator in her hand. She pressed her back against the cool, damp concrete and closed her eyes. She didn't listen for the trucks. She didn't listen for the drones. She listened to the earth. She felt the vibration through her spine, the low, 4 hertz hum that was the signature of the hydraulic breach. It was getting stronger. The limestone was groaning, a sound like a giant's teeth grinding in its sleep. She felt the first tremor, not a shake, but a subtle, sickening shift in the ground's center of gravity. The valley was tipping. She looked toward the mouth of the canyon. She saw the dust cloud of the 3rd Battalion. She saw the glint of the sun on the lead striker's armor. They were 500 yards from the trap. Elena Vance stood up, her finger on the trigger of the jury-rigged detonator. She felt the weight of the institution she had served, the weight of the men who had ignored her, and the weight of the ground that had never lied. She looked at the water, she looked at the fire, and she waited for the exact moment the world began to fall. She didn't feel like a victim. She didn't feel like a casualty. She felt like a surveyor measuring the final, devastating distance between the truth and the lie. The lead striker reached the 200-yard mark. The ground beneath it began to weep, the water bubbling up through the sand in dark, oily pools. The driver didn't see it. The commander didn't see it, but Elena saw it. She saw the geometry of the collapse. She took a breath, the air cold and sharp in her lungs, and she pressed the button. The explosion wasn't loud. It was a deep guttural asterisk crump asterisk that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. The dam didn't shatter, it unzipped. A wall of pent-up, high-pressure water erupted from the base, a gray-white roar that tore through the limestone and slammed into the valley floor. The sound was a physical weight, a wall of noise that drowned out the world. And then the ground gave way, not in a landslide, but in a clean, terrifying vertical drop. A section of the road 300 yards long simply vanished into the earth, swallowed by the karst pockets that Elena had mapped in the dark. The lead striker slammed on its brakes, its front wheels hovering over the edge of a new 50-foot chasm. The rest of the battalion ground to a halt, a line of steel monsters suddenly paralyzed by a terrain that had been cleared. Elena stood on the edge of the breach, the spray from the dam coating her in a fine, icy mist. She watched as the soldiers spilled out of their vehicles, their weapons ready, their eyes searching the ridgelines for an enemy that wasn't there. They were looking for the war. They were looking for the insurgents. They didn't see the woman standing on the ridge above the dam, the water-stained surveyor who had just saved their lives by destroying their path. Elena felt the Zippo in her hand, the metal warm against her palm. She looked down at the chasm, at the secret geometry of the valley she had finally made visible. She was right. She was absolutely, devastatingly right. And she knew, as she watched the first Apache helicopter crest the ridgeline to investigate the explosion, that the cost of being right was just beginning to be calculated. She turned away from the chasm, her boots finding the rhythm of the slope as she began to walk toward the eastern ridge where Miller was waiting. She didn't look back at the battalion. She didn't look back at the dam. She looked at the ground, and for the first time in 15 years, she felt like she was home. But the silence was short-lived. As she climbed the first rocky outcrop, her handheld radio crackled to life. It wasn't Miller's voice. It wasn't Gather's. It was a frequency she had never heard before, a low, rhythmic tapping that she recognized instantly. Asterisk click, 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 click. Asterisk, it was the signal from the ghost network. But it wasn't coming from the tunnel. It was coming from the ridge she was currently standing on. It was coming from the very ground she thought she had mastered. Elena stopped, her hand frozen on the rock. She realized with a sudden, icy clarity that the dam hadn't been the target. The battalion hadn't been the target. They were the distraction. The real move was happening now, and she was standing right in the middle of it. She looked up at the ridge, and for the first time the map lady saw something she hadn't put on her map. She saw the movement of the shadows against the limestone, shadows that weren't being cast by the sun. The war for the Sorobai Valley hadn't just escalated, it had changed its face. And Elena Vance was the only one who knew that the ground beneath her was about to breathe again. She reached for the thermal scope, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She adjusted the focus, the digital screen flickering to life. She swept the ridgeline, looking for the heat signatures of the men she knew were there. But she didn't find men. She found something else, something large, cold, and metallic buried deep within the rock of the ridge. It was a structural anomaly that defied everything she knew about the geology of the valley. It was a void, but it was a void with a shape that looked like a door. And as she watched, the door began to open. The institutional failure was complete. They had sent a battalion to fight a shadow, and they had ignored the woman who had found the wall. Now the wall was moving, and Elena Vance was the only thing standing between the professionals and a reality they weren't prepared to face. She keyed her radio, her voice a whisper that was lost in the roar of the water below. "Miller, get the strikers' comms. Tell them to turn their guns around. Tell them the threat isn't in the hole. The threat is in the mountain." But the radio was dead. The frequency was being jammed by a signal so powerful it made the device in her hand vibrate with heat. She was alone. She was non-operational. She was a ghost on the edge of a new, terrifying world. She looked at the door in the mountain and she made her final decision. She didn't run for the ridge. She didn't hide in the rocks. She took her M4, checked the chamber, and began to climb toward the shadow. The map lady was going into the mountain, and she wasn't coming back until she had mapped the heart of the fire. The stone of the ridge felt different under Elena's palms as she pulled herself upward, not like the porous, ancient limestone of the Sorobai, but like something reinforced, something cold and industrial that had been skin-grafted onto the earth. Every breath she took tasted of ozone and a strange, metallic dampness that didn't belong in the high desert. Below her, the 3rd Battalion was a collection of toy soldiers milling around a sandbox, their voices rising in a confused, chaotic babble that the wind stripped away before it could reach her. They were safe from the sinkhole, but they were blind to the mountain that was currently yawning open above their heads. She reached a narrow ledge 20 feet below the shadow door and pressed her back against the rock. Her lungs were burning, the effort of the climb tearing at the stitches in her arm, but she didn't allow herself the luxury of a wince. She was in the space where the world of the map ended and the world of the ground began, and in this space, pain was just another data point to be managed. She looked up. The door wasn't a door in the traditional sense. It was a retractable slab of granite-faced steel, a piece of engineering so precise that when it was closed, the seams were indistinguishable from the natural fissures of the cliffside. It had slid back into a recessed pocket, revealing a throat of smooth, dark concrete that sloped downward into the bowels of the ridge. There were no lights, no guards, no signs of life. Just the low, rhythmic hum she had been tracking, a sound that she now realized wasn't water pressure. It was a ventilation system, a massive, industrial-grade heart beating in the dark. Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass Zippo. She didn't light it. She just held the weight of it, the cold metal a grounding wire for her frayed nerves. She had spent 20 years looking for the hidden things, the discrepancies that everyone else ignored. She had found the ghost network, the hydraulic breach, and the secret map. But this was the 0 point. This was the place where the lie was being manufactured. She adjusted her plate carrier, feeling the hard edge of the thumb drive Miller had given her. It contained the seismic data, the heartbeat of this mountain. She was the only person on the planet who knew this place existed, and if she died here, the mountain would simply close its mouth and wait for the next battalion to walk into its shadow. She looked down at the strikers one last time. They were beginning to set up a perimeter around the sinkhole, their floodlights cutting through the gathering gloom. They thought they were in a defensive posture. They didn't realize they were sitting in the kill zone of whatever was inside this ridge. Elena turned her face toward the dark throat of the mountain. She didn't have a team. She didn't have a radio. She didn't have authorization. She had a rifle, a thumb drive, and a map of a world that didn't exist yet. She stepped off the ledge and into the concrete tunnel, her boots silent on the smooth surface. The air inside was cool and smelled of old grease and recycled oxygen. As she moved deeper, the light from the valley floor began to fade, replaced by a dim red emergency glow that pulsed in time with the ventilation hum. She had been walking for 50 yards when the sound changed. It wasn't the hum anymore. It was the sound of voices, low, rhythmic, and speaking in a language that wasn't the local dialect of the Surobai. It was the clipped, precise tone of contractors, the kind of men who worked for agencies and corporations that didn't have names. Elena froze, her back against the concrete wall. She looked around the corner, her thermal scope raised to her eye. What she saw didn't belong in the Hindu Kush. It was a staging area, a vast, subterranean hangar carved out of the rock. It was filled with equipment she recognized from the high-tech corridors of the Pentagon, modular server racks, encrypted comms arrays, and rows of sleek black drones that looked like nothing the Air Force had in its inventory. There were men in tactical gear moving between the racks, their movements efficient and rehearsed. They weren't insurgents. They weren't soldiers. They were something else. And in the center of the hangar, mounted on a raised platform, was a massive, high-gain satellite dish, the twin of the one Elena had used back at the comms shed, but this one was pointed not at a communications satellite, but at the very ridge where the 3rd Battalion was currently stationed. Elena felt the cold realization wash over her. The ghost network wasn't an insurgent signal. It was an institutional one. The hydraulic breach, the sinkhole, the attack on the FOB, it wasn't a war. It was a test, a field demonstration of a new kind of terrain denial weapon being conducted on an unsuspecting American battalion to prove its lethality to a buyer she couldn't even imagine. Sterling hadn't been a victim of the fire. He had been a witness who needed to be erased. And the map she had given to Gathers. She realized with a sickening jolt that she hadn't given him the truth. She had given him the results. She felt the dark competence within her turn into a cold, diamond-hard rage. The institution hadn't failed because it was blind. It had failed because it was complicit. They were using the Surobai Valley as a laboratory, and the men of the 3rd Battalion were the lab rats. Elena looked at the satellite dish, then at the server racks. She knew what she had to do. She didn't need to call for help. She needed to burn the data. She began to move through the shadows of the hangar, her movements a series of calculated risks. She wasn't a soldier now. She was a surveyor of a different kind of terrain, the terrain of a conspiracy that reached higher than she had ever dared to look. She reached the first server rack and pulled a small, incendiary charge from her kit, a piece of emergency gear she had scavenged from the TOC ruins. She wasn't going to map this place. She was going to erase it. But as she reached for the detonator, a voice echoed through the hangar, a voice that was familiar, authoritative, and utterly cold. "Chief Vance," the voice said, "I knew you wouldn't be able to stay away from the ground. You always did have a gift for finding the things no one else wanted to see." Elena turned, her rifle raised. Standing on the platform, silhouetted by the red glow of the server racks, was Colonel Gathers. He wasn't wearing his uniform now. He was wearing a dark, tactical jacket, and in his hand he held her Mylar map case. "You should have taken the transport to Landstuhl, Elena," Gathers said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "You could have had a nice retirement, a medal for your bravery at Blackwood, but you just couldn't stop looking at the shadows, could you?" Elena looked at him, her eyes steady, her finger on the trigger. She didn't feel fear. She felt the clarity of a woman who had finally found the center of the map. "The 3rd Battalion is sitting on a kill zone, Colonel," she said, her voice a quiet, unbreakable rasp. "And you're holding the remote." Gathers smiled, a thin, joyless expression. "It's not a kill zone, Elena. It's a proof of concept, and you're the only data point we didn't account for." He raised a hand, and from the shadows of the hangar, a dozen red laser dots appeared on Elena's chest, a constellation of light that signaled the end of the map. "The problem with being the only person who knows the truth," Gathers said, stepping off the platform, "is that you're also the only person who has to die for it." Elena Vance looked at the laser dots, then at the incendiary charge in her hand. She felt the weight of the Zippo in her pocket, the cold metal of the thumb drive against her ribs, and the rhythm of the mountain beating in her ears. She didn't beg. She didn't perform her pain. She looked at Gathers, and she did the only thing a surveyor does when the map is a lie. She started a new one. "I'm not the only data point, Colonel," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm the fire." She pressed the detonator. The chemical white of the magnesium flare didn't just illuminate the hangar, it erased it, turning the high-tech sanctuary into a bleached-out void where for 3 seconds sight was a liability. Elena didn't wait for the sound. She knew the physics of the incendiary charge she'd rigged to the primary server rack, the way the heat would liquefy the copper wiring and turn the plastic casings into a toxic, black slurry. The roar followed a heartbeat later, a percussive slap that buckled the air in her lungs and sent a ripple of heat across her face that felt like a physical blow. She was already moving before the first server rack toppled, her boots finding purchase on the smooth concrete as she dove behind a heavy crate marked with a Department of Defense logistics code that she knew was a lie. The fire didn't scream. It ate. It hissed through the halon suppression lines, which were useless against a magnesium-fed burn, and within seconds, the red emergency lighting was drowned out by a flickering, hungry orange. Across the hangar, the red laser dots that had been tattooed across her chest vanished, the shooters blinded by the sudden bloom of the sun inside their dark room. Elena didn't hesitate. She didn't look back to see if Gathers had been caught in the blast. She knew men like Gathers. They were the kind of creatures who always kept a shadow between themselves and the heat. She checked the seal on her rifle, her fingers moving with the cold, rhythmic precision of a woman who had spent half her life stripping weapons in the dark. The hangar was a chaos of sound now, the high-pitched whine of dying electronics, the shouting of men who had been trained for surgical strikes but were currently facing a geological event, and the deep, groaning complaint of the mountain itself. Elena stayed low, her vision beginning to return in jagged, purple patches. She wasn't looking for an exit, she was looking for a fault line. She knew the geometry of this place better than the men who had built it, because she knew what the concrete was hiding. This hangar wasn't just a room. It was a wound in the limestone, held open by sheer mechanical will. She reached the edge of the staging area, where the smooth floor met the raw, jagged rock of the mountain's interior. To her left, a row of the sleek black drones, the proof of concept that Gathers had boasted about, sat on their cradles like predatory insects. She didn't have the explosives to take them all out, but she didn't need to. She reached into her utility pouch and pulled out a small, handheld seismic vibrator, a tool used for measuring soil density. She jammed it into the gap between the concrete floor and the rock wall, set the frequency to a devastating 7 Hz resonance, and turned it to maximum. The vibration was subtle at first, a hum that lived in the teeth, but within seconds it began to speak to the mountain. The limestone, already stressed by the hydraulic breach she'd triggered at the dam, began to respond. A crack loud as a sniper's round split the floor beneath the drone cradles. The concrete didn't just break, it delaminated, the heavy machines tilting and sliding into the widening more of the earth. "Chief Vance!" Gather's voice roared over the intercom system, distorted and echoing like the voice of a ghost. "You're destroying billions of dollars in Tier 1 assets. Stop now and we can still walk you out of here. You're a patriot, Elena. Think about the mission." Elena didn't answer. She was busy counting the seconds between the groans of the rock. She moved into a narrow service tunnel, the walls weeping with the same cold, metallic water she'd seen at the dam. Her bandaged arm was screaming now, the heat from the explosion having tightened the skin until it felt ready to burst. But she pushed the sensation into a small, dark box in her mind and locked it. She wasn't a patriot in the way Gathers meant it. She wasn't loyal to the billions of dollars or the Tier 1 assets. She was loyal to the 3rd Battalion, currently sitting in the mud 500 yards away, and to the truth of the ground they stood on. She reached a vertical shaft, a ventilation duct that smelled of ozone and mountain air. She began to climb, her boots slipping on the wet metal rungs. Below her, the hangar was a hellscape of orange flame and black smoke. She could see the shapes of Gather's mercenaries moving through the haze, their tactical lights cutting uselessly through the soot. They were looking for a person. They should have been looking for a way to stop the mountain from swallowing them whole. The climb was a brutal, airless eternity. Every muscle in her back felt like it was being shredded by a dull blade, and her breath came in ragged, burning gasps. She was 40 feet up when the first secondary explosion hit. It was the fuel cells for the drones, a series of sharp, rhythmic pops that sent a plume of fire up the shaft. Elena pressed her body against the cold metal, the heat licking at her heels, and she didn't scream. She didn't have the oxygen for it. She just climbed. She emerged onto a narrow exterior ledge, 500 feet above the valley floor. The air was freezing, a sharp, crystalline shock after the furnace of the hangar. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky the color of a faded bruise. Below her, the Sorobai Valley looked like a charcoal drawing, the lights of the 3rd Battalion strikers tiny, flickering embers in the vast, unforgiving dark. "Miller," she whispered into her radio, the wind whipping the words away as soon as they left her lips. "Miller, do you copy?" Static, and then a voice so small it barely registered. "Chief. Chief, is that you?" "The mountain." The whole ridge just lit up. "I thought you were gone." "I'm here," Elena said, her voice a dry rasp. "Listen to me, Miller. The 3rd Battalion is still in the kill zone. The sinkhole was just the beginning. Gathers has a high-gain uplink on this ridge. He's using it to broadcast a signal that's triggering the hydraulic pumps in the valley floor. If that signal stays live, the whole shelf is going to go. You have to get to the battalion commander. Tell him to move his men to the eastern slope, now." "They won't listen to me, Chief. I'm a comms tech in a stolen vehicle. They think I'm a deserter." "Make them listen," Elena said, her eyes fixed on a structure further up the ridge, the satellite dish, a white, skeletal hand reaching for the stars. "I'm going for the uplink. If I can take it down, the pumps will fail. But you have to get them moving. If I fail, Miller, you're the only map they have left." She didn't wait for his reply. She began to climb again, not up a ladder this time, but up the raw face of the cliff. The limestone was brittle, crumbling under her fingers, but she moved with a dark competence that bypassed the need for safety. She wasn't thinking about the fall. She was thinking about the 4 Hertz pulse, the heartbeat of the weapon that was currently trying to liquefy the world below her. The satellite dish was guarded. 2 men in matte black tactical gear stood near the base of the platform, their nods, night vision goggles, glowing a ghostly green. They weren't looking at the valley, they were looking at the access path. They didn't expect anyone to come from the cliff face. Elena pulled herself over the edge of the platform, her movements slow and deliberate. She was 10 feet away from them, her silhouette lost against the jagged rocks. She didn't use her rifle. The sound would carry for miles in the thin air, and she didn't know how many more of Gather's men were on the ridge. She drew her combat knife, the steel cold and silent in the starlight. The first guard didn't even have time to turn. Elena was on him like a shadow, her hand clamping over his mouth as the blade found the gap between his helmet and his plate carrier. He went down without a sound, a heavy dead weight that she lowered gently to the metal grating. The second guard turned, his rifle coming up, but Elena was already moving. She didn't tackle him. She used his own momentum, sweeping his leg and driving her elbow into his temple with a sickening asterisk thud asterisk. He hit the deck hard, his rifle clattering away. Elena didn't kill him. She didn't have the time or the inclination. She moved to the control console at the base of the dish, her fingers flying over the keypad. It was encrypted, a high-level JSOC lock that should have taken hours to bypass. But Elena didn't need to bypass the software. She knew the hardware. She looked at the cabling, the thick, braided lines that fed power to the transmitter. She didn't look for a shutdown command. She looked for the overload. She reached into her kit and pulled out the thumb drive, the one Miller had given her, the one that held the raw seismic data of the mountain's collapse. She jammed it into the console's maintenance port and began to upload the file directly into the dish's steering logic. She wasn't just giving the system data. She was giving it a mirror. She was forcing the transmitter to broadcast the frequency of its own destruction. The dish began to hum, a low, vibrating growl that shook the very platform she was standing on. The steering motors whined in protest as the massive white bowl began to track back and forth, trying to follow a signal that didn't exist. "What are you doing, Vance?" The voice came from the darkness behind her. Elena didn't turn. She knew the sound of that safety being clicked off. Colonel Gathers stepped into the light of the console, his face a mask of controlled, professional fury. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his uniform singed and torn, but his pistol was steady. "You're a geologist, Elena," Gathers said, his voice tight. "You understand the concept of necessary loss. To build something new, you have to clear the ground. The Sorobai project. It's bigger than a few dozen soldiers. It's the future of asymmetric warfare. It's the end of the front line." "The front line is wherever people are dying for a lie, Colonel," Elena said, her hand hovering over the execute key on the console. "And you've been lying to the ground since you got here." "Step away from the console," Gathers ordered. "I won't tell you again. You've done enough damage. Look at the valley. Look at what you've done to the project." "I'm looking at the men," Elena said. She turned then, her eyes locking onto his. She didn't look like a victim. She didn't look like a non-operational technician. She looked like the mountain. "I'm looking at the people you decided were data points, and I'm telling you the data is corrupted." "You're going to die for a map that no one will ever see," Gathers said. "The map isn't for the people in the rooms, Colonel," Elena said. "The map is for the people in the dirt." She pressed the key. The satellite dish didn't explode, it screamed. The high-gain transmitter, forced to broadcast a feedback loop of its own resonance, began to shake itself apart. The heavy steel gears ground into powder, and a shower of blue sparks erupted from the feed horn. The signal, the 4 Hertz pulse that was holding the valley in a state of hydraulic liquefaction, shattered. Gathers fired. The round caught Elena in the shoulder, the impact spinning her around and slamming her against the console. The pain was a white-hot spike that blinded her for a second, but she didn't fall. She gripped the edge of the metal, her blood slicking the keys, and she looked at Gathers. He was staring at the dish, his face pale in the flickering light of the short-circuiting electronics. He knew what it meant. The proof of concept was gone, the data was destroyed, the mountain was winning. You stupid woman," Gathers whispered, his voice trembling. "You've ruined everything." "No," Elena said, her voice a wet, ragged sound. "I just balanced the books." Below them in the valley, a sound rose up that was louder than any explosion. It was the sound of the water receding, a massive sucking gasp as the hydraulic pressure failed and the limestone pockets began to drain. The ground was settling, the trap turning back into solid earth. Gathers raised his pistol again, his eyes wide with a desperate animal panic. He didn't see the movement behind him. He didn't see the shadow that had been tracking him since he left the hangar. The ranger sergeant, the one with the limp and the thermal scope, stepped out of the rocks, his M4 leveled at Gathers' head. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask for a surrender. He just looked at Elena, saw the blood on her shoulder, and then looked at Gathers. "Colonel," the sergeant said, his voice as cold as the mountain air. "I think you're in the wrong sector." Gathers froze, the pistol shaking in his hand. He looked at the sergeant, then at the burning hangar below, then back at Elena. He was a man who had built his career on the certainty of his own importance, and in that moment he realized he was the only thing on the mountain that didn't matter. "Drop it," the sergeant said. Gathers let the pistol fall. It hit the metal grating with a hollow asterisk clatter asterisk. Elena felt the world beginning to tilt. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a crushing, soul-deep exhaustion that made her bones feel like they were made of lead. She slid down the side of the console, her back against the warm metal, and she watched the stars. They were bright here, away from the smoke and the fire, a million tiny points of truth in a world that was mostly shadow. The sergeant moved to her side, his hands sure and steady as he began to apply a pressure dressing to her shoulder. "Easy, Chief. You're okay. We've got the 3rd Battalion moving." Miller got through to the commander. "They are secure. The map," Elena whispered, her eyes fluttering. "The map is safe," the sergeant said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You did it, Vance. You broke the ground." The hours that followed were a blur of motion and pain, a series of disjointed images that felt like a film running at the wrong speed. She remembered being carried down the ridge, the jolting movement of the sergeant's stride sending flares of agony through her shoulder. She remembered the smell of the dust as they reached the valley floor, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and diesel. She remembered the faces of the men of the 3rd Battalion, the way they looked at her as she was carried past their strikers. They didn't know her name. They didn't know about the hangar or the proof of concept. They just knew that the ground had tried to swallow them and that somehow the map lady had held it together. There was no cheering. There were no medals. There was just a heavy, respectful silence, the kind of silence you give to a person who has walked into the dark and come back with the light. She was loaded into a medical Humvee, the interior smelling of antiseptic and stale sweat. Miller was there, his face streaked with tears and soot, his hand gripping her so hard she thought her fingers might break. "We did it, Chief," he kept saying over and over. "We did it." Elena didn't answer. She was watching the mountain. From the back of the Humvee, she could see the ridge glowing with the last embers of the hangar fire. It looked like a volcano, a wound in the earth that was finally beginning to scab over. She felt the Zippo in her pocket, the cold, hard weight of it against her leg. She had lost her career. She had lost her standing in the institution. She had a hole in her shoulder and a body that would never quite feel the same again. But as the Humvee began to pull away, moving across the solid, unyielding ground of the Sorobai Valley, Elena Vance felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known in 20 years. The institutional reckoning hadn't arrived yet. The lawyers and the generals and the analysts would come later, with their questions and their depositions, and their attempts to bury the truth in a mountain of paperwork. They would try to make her a hero or a traitor or a casualty of stress. But they couldn't take the ground. She closed her eyes, the rhythmic thrum of the Humvee's tires on the road, a soothing, steady heartbeat. She wasn't a surveyor anymore. She wasn't a technician. She was a woman who had seen the world for what it was and who had found the strength to hold it in place. As the vehicle moved toward the horizon, where the first light of a new day was beginning to touch the peaks of the Hindu Kush, Elena Vance finally let go. She didn't fall into the dark. She fell into the earth, and for the first time in her life, the ground was solid. The immediate aftermath was a quiet, surreal landscape of recovery and confusion. The 3rd Battalion sat in a wide, defensive circle on the plateau she had designated as safe, their headlights cutting long, lonely paths through the cooling desert air. There were no orders coming from Bagram. The ghost network was silent. The sky above them was empty of drones, the high-altitude observers having been blinded or recalled when the uplink shattered. Elena lay on the floor of the Humvee, her breath hitched in short, shallow rhythms. Every bump in the road was a jagged reminder of the cost, but she didn't complain. She watched the dust motes dance in the beam of Miller's flashlight, the same way she had watched them in the med tent an eternity ago. The world was small now, just the smell of the dressing on her shoulder, the heat of Miller's hand, and the knowledge that the 3rd Battalion was still breathing. "Chief," Miller whispered, leaning closer. "The sergeant." He took Gathers to the lead striker. "He's holding him under field arrest. He says he doesn't care about the rank. He says the colonel has some explaining to do to the men he almost drowned." Elena managed a ghost of a smile. "Gathers will talk his way out of it, Miller. Men like him always do. He'll call it a training exercise that went wrong. He'll blame the equipment. He'll blame me." "Let him try," Miller said, his jaw tightening. "I still have the backup drive and the sergeant. He has the footage from his thermal scope. He saw the hangar, Elena. He saw the drones. They can't hide it all." "They'll try," Elena said. She knew the institution. She knew the way it protected its own, the way it smoothed over the jagged edges of its failures until everything looked like a success. They would bury the proof of concept in a classified file, and they would bury her along with it. But it didn't matter. She looked out the window at the valley floor. The sinkhole was still there, a massive, dark scar in the earth, but the water was gone. The limestone was drying. The geography of the Sorobai had been changed, but it had been changed by her hand, not by a weapon. She felt a strange, detached sense of accomplishment. She had been the most experienced person in the room, and she had been treated as the least. She had been dismissed, humiliated, and hunted. And in the end, she had been the only one who knew the way out. The Humvee reached the temporary perimeter of the 3rd Battalion's camp. The soldiers there didn't look like the crisp, professional operators Gathers had employed. They were dirty, tired, and scared. They were young men from places like Ohio and Georgia and Montana, men who had signed up to serve a country and had found themselves caught in a laboratory experiment. When the Humvee stopped, a young lieutenant approached the door. He didn't look at Miller, he looked at Elena. He saw the blood, the soot, and the hard, controlled light in her eyes. He didn't know who she was, but he knew what she had done. "Ma'am," the lieutenant said, his voice cracking slightly. "The commander wants to thank you, he says. He says he's sorry he didn't listen to the radio." Elena looked at him, her gaze unflinching. "Don't thank me, Lieutenant. Just watch the ground. It's the only thing that doesn't lie to you." She let the medic take her then, her body finally surrendering to the weight of the night. As she was lifted onto the stretcher, she felt the cool air of the valley on her face, a clean, sharp wind that tasted of nothing but stone and distance. The institutional reckoning was coming. The future was a map she hadn't drawn yet, a landscape of court-martials and classified hearings, and the quiet, permanent loss of the only life she had ever known. But as the sun began to crest the eastern ridge, turning the peaks of the mountains into a jagged line of fire, Elena Vance knew that she had earned the right to walk away. She had found the hidden thing. She had mapped the fire, and she had saved the men who would never know her name. The map lady was tired, but for the first time in 15 years, she was sure of her coordinates. The silence of the valley was different now. It wasn't the silence of a trap waiting to be sprung. It was the silence of a world that had been saved from itself. As the first medevac helicopter appeared on the horizon, its rhythmic asterisk thud-thud-thump asterisk a heartbeat in the morning light, Elena Vance closed her eyes and let the map fade into the dark. She was Elena Vance. She was a chief warrant officer in the United States Army. She was a surveyor of truths, and she was still standing. The cost was absolute. Her career was a ruin of burnt paper and shattered protocols. Her body was a map of scars and bruises. Her standing in the world she had served was a question mark that would likely be answered with a dishonorable discharge or a quiet, forced retirement. She had betrayed the chain of command to save the mission. She had acted without orders, stolen a vehicle, and destroyed billions of dollars in government property. But as she felt the lift of the helicopter taking her away from the Sorobai, Elena Vance didn't feel like a criminal. She felt like a person who had finally seen the whole picture. The institution was a machine designed to win wars and manage data. But the ground was a living thing, and it didn't care about hierarchies or budgets. It only cared about the weight you put on it. She had balanced the weight. She had corrected the map. And as the valley fell away beneath her, a vast, beautiful expanse of limestone and shadow, Elena Vance knew that no matter what the report said, she was the only one who knew where the solid ground really was. The pilot of the Black Hawk banked the aircraft toward Bagram, the morning sun flooding the cabin with a harsh, golden light. He caught Elena's eye in the reflection of the cockpit glass, a brief professional nod from one operator to another. He didn't know the story. He didn't know about the hangar or Gathers or the 4 Hertz pulse. He just saw a soldier who had been through the meat grinder and was still holding her head up. Elena nodded back, a small, weary gesture that cost her more than the climb had. She looked down at her hands, which were stained with grease and blood and the dust of the Sorobai. They were the hands of a technician, the hands of a surveyor. They were the hands of the woman who had broken the world to save it. The descent into Bagram was a descent into the world of labels and categories. As the helicopter touched down on the tarmac, the map lady was already being transformed into a subject of interest. The men in the clean uniforms were waiting, their clipboards and their questions ready. But as the doors opened and the medics moved toward her, Elena Vance reached into her pocket one last time. She felt the thumb drive, the one that held the truth of the mountain. She didn't give it to the medics. She didn't give it to the officers. She tucked it into the lining of her boot, a secret map for a journey that was just beginning. She looked at the hangar where the transport to Landstuhl was waiting. She looked at the flags snapping in the wind. And then she looked at the mountains far to the west where the dust was still settling over the ruins of a lie. "Chief Vance," a voice said, authoritative and cold. "We need to talk about your report." Elena Vance looked at the man, a major from the CID, his face a mask of institutional curiosity. She didn't blink, she didn't beg, she didn't perform her pain. "I've already filed it, Major," she said, her voice a quiet, dangerous sound. "It's written in the limestone. If you want to read it, you're going to have to go back into the hole." She stepped off the helicopter, her limp pronounced but her spine a rigid line of defiance. She walked toward the reckoning, her head up, her eyes on the horizon. The map lady was done with the shadows. She was ready for the light. The sun was high now, the heat beginning to pulse off the tarmac in long, shimmering waves. It was a beautiful day in the Sorobai Valley. The ground was solid. The men were alive, and for Elena Vance, that was the only data point that mattered. She walked into the hangar, the darkness of the interior swallowing her whole, but she wasn't afraid. She knew the way out. She had mapped the fire, and she had come back with the truth. The institutional failure was a quiet, grinding sound, but it was a sound she no longer had to listen to. She had found her own rhythm, her own frequency. And as the doors of the hangar closed behind her, Elena Vance felt the weight of the world shift, settling into a new, honest geometry. She was right, and for once being right was enough. The cost was permanent. The victory was quiet, and the truth was buried deep within the rock, waiting for the next person who was brave enough to look at the ground and see the world for what it really was. Elena Vance was that person, and she was just getting started. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of silence. In the hours after the 3rd Battalion moved to the safety of the eastern ridge, the Sorobai Valley became a cathedral of stillness. The hydraulic pumps had died with the uplink, and the water that had been weaponized against the earth began to seep back into the deep aquifers, leaving the surface scorched and scarred but stable. The sinkhole remained, a massive, jagged eye staring up at the sky, but the monster that had created it was gone. Miller sat on the edge of the plateau, his stolen radio clutched in his hands. He watched the medevac helicopter disappear into the haze of the horizon, carrying Elena Vance away from the world she had saved. He felt a strange, hollow sensation in his chest, a mix of relief and a terrifying, cold realization. He was a comms tech who had helped a non-operational warrant officer destroy a multi-billion-dollar project. He was a witness to a crime that the military would spend the next decade trying to uninvent. He looked at the 3rd Battalion commander who was standing a few yards away, staring into the abyss of the sinkhole. The man looked old, older than his rank, older than the war. He was a man who had been saved by a ghost, and he didn't know what to do with the debt. "Sir?" Miller asked, his voice shaking. The commander turned, his eyes unfocused. "Who was she, Corporal?" "She's Chief Vance, sir," Miller said, his voice gaining strength. "She's the one who mapped the ground." The commander looked at the sinkhole, then at the ridge where the smoke was still rising from the hangar. He nodded once, a slow, heavy movement. "Remind me to thank her if we ever see her again." "You won't see her, sir," Miller said, looking back at the horizon. "She's not the kind of person you see. She's the kind of person who sees you." And in the silence of the Sorobai morning, Miller finally understood the cost of being the map lady. It wasn't about the medals or the recognition. It was about being the only one who knew the truth, and the only one who was willing to burn the world to protect it. The institutional reckoning was beginning to stir, far away in the air-conditioned rooms of Bagram and Kabul. The phone lines were humming with frantic, coded messages. The senior analysts were scrambling to delete files and scrub manifests. The machinery of the lie was resetting itself, preparing to absorb the failure and turn it into a success. But the 3rd Battalion was alive. The ground was solid, and Elena Vance was still standing. The story of the Sorobai Valley would be told in a dozen different ways. It would be a tectonic event, a logistical error, a brilliant tactical retreat. It would be anything and everything except the truth. But as the sun reached its zenith, casting short, hard shadows across the valley floor, the men of the 3rd Battalion didn't look at the reports. They looked at the road. They looked at the mountains. And they remembered the woman who had walked into the fire to give them back the earth. Elena Vance had mapped the fire, and the fire had left her clean. The cost was her career. The cost was her body. The cost was the only life she had ever known. But as she lay in the back of the transport plane, the cold air of the high altitude numbing the pain in her shoulder, Elena Vance felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any map. She had seen the world. She had found the truth, and she had held the ground. The reckoning was coming. But for now, there was only the flight, the stars, and the solid, unyielding truth of a mission accomplished. She was Elena Vance. She was a surveyor, and she was home. The plane banked toward the west, leaving the Sorobai Valley behind. The mountains looked small from here, tiny, jagged teeth in the maw of the earth. But Elena knew better. She knew the weight of them. She knew the secret rhythm of their hearts. She closed her eyes and let the map fade. She didn't need it anymore. She knew the way. She was the fire, and the fire was finally out. The immediate aftermath was not an end, but a transition. Elena Vance was no longer a part of the machine. She was a witness to it. And as the transport plane touched down on the tarmac at Landstuhl, she knew that the real battle, the one for the truth, was only just beginning. She stepped off the plane, her boot hitting the solid ground of Germany with a firm, decisive asterisk thud asterisk. She didn't look for the medics. She didn't look for the officers. She looked for the horizon. She was Elena Vance, and she was ready for the next map. The institutional failure was complete, but the human victory was absolute, and in the end, that was the only coordinate that mattered. The map lady had found her place, and it wasn't on the page. It was in the world. The 3rd Battalion would move on. The Sorobai project would be buried. The war would continue. But the ground would remember Elena Vance. It would remember the woman who had seen its secrets and had chosen to protect them. She walked into the med center, her head up, her heart steady. She was ready for the reckoning. She was ready for the truth. She was Elena Vance, and she was still standing. The cost was her life as she knew it, but the prize was the person she had become. And as the doors of the med center closed behind her, Elena Vance felt the weight of the world shift, settling into a new, honest geometry. She was right, and for once being right was enough. The story was written in the limestone. It was written in the blood. It was written in the stars. Elena Vance had mapped the fire, and she had come back to tell the tale. But she didn't tell it to the generals. She didn't tell it to the analysts. She told it to the ground. And the ground, for the first time in 100 years, was silent. The fluorescent light in the Bagram Trauma Center hummed at 60 hertz, a sharp, electric buzz that vibrated inside the stitches of Elena's shoulder. It was a sterile, unforgiving sound, a stark contrast to the low, grinding roar of the Sorobai mountain that still lived in the marrow of her bones. She lay on a narrow cot behind a blue privacy curtain that smelled of bleach and industrial-strength lavender, her left arm immobilized in a heavy sling that felt like it was made of lead. They had given her morphine for the surgery, a thick, syrupy fog that tried to pull her under, but Elena fought it. She stayed in the shallow water of consciousness, her eyes fixed on a small, jagged coffee stain on the ceiling tile that looked vaguely like the topographic map of Montana. She needed to stay awake because she knew that in the military, the moment you stopped watching the room was the moment they changed the story. The door at the end of the ward hissed open, the sound of polished low quarters clicking against the linoleum signaling the arrival of the first wave. It wasn't the medics. Medics walked with a soft, frantic rhythm. These footsteps were deliberate, measured, and heavy with the weight of a dozen different regulations. Elena didn't move. She didn't even adjust her breathing. She simply waited as the shadow of a man appeared against the blue fabric of the curtain. He didn't ask for permission to enter. He just pulled the slide back, the plastic rings screeching like a warning. Major Marcus Thorne of the Criminal Investigation Division didn't look like a man who had spent the night worrying about the 300 soldiers of the 3rd Battalion. He looked like a man who had spent the night reading a spreadsheet of destroyed Tier 1 assets. He was impeccably clean, his ACUs pressed, his silver oak leaves catching the harsh overhead light. He carried a ruggedized tablet in one hand and a thin manila folder in the other. He pulled a rolling stool over to the side of Elena's bed, the wheels squeaking on the floor, and sat down with the practiced ease of a predator who had all the time in the world. "Chief Warrant Officer Vance," Thorne said, his voice a flat Midwestern monotone. "You've had a busy 48 hours. The surgeons say you're lucky the round missed the artery. Another half-inch and you'd be a memory." Elena looked at him, her gaze cool and unblinking. She didn't thank him for the medical update. She didn't ask about her status. She just watched the way his thumb rhythmically tapped against the side of the folder. "The ground was solid, Major," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "Luck didn't have much to do with it." Thorne leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Is that what we're calling it, solid ground? Because from where I'm sitting, the ground looks like a $4 billion crater. I've spent the last 6 hours reviewing the preliminary reports from the Sorobai Valley. I've got a hangar that's been liquefied by magnesium fire. I've got a high-gain satellite uplink that looks like it was hit by a localized earthquake. And I've got a colonel, a highly decorated officer with 24 years of service, claiming that you went rogue, sabotaged a classified research facility, and nearly caused a catastrophic international incident. Elena felt the controlled rage tightening in her chest, a cold, sharp blade that she kept sheathed. She didn't let it reach her eyes. She didn't let it change the rhythm of her heart. Colonel Gathers was using a high-frequency hydraulic pulse to weaponize the limestone shelf beneath the 3rd Battalion's AO, she said, her voice steady. He was going to sink an entire battalion to prove a concept for asymmetric geological warfare. I didn't sabotage a facility. I prevented a mass casualty event. That's a hell of a story, Vance, Thorne said, tapping the tablet screen. The problem is the facility doesn't exist. According to the JSOC manifest, that hangar was a temporary storage site for decommissioned drone parts. There is no record of a geological weapon. There is no record of a hydraulic pulse. And the seismic data you claim to have uploaded to the uplink, it's gone. Fried in the short circuit. All we have is a pile of melted copper and a lot of very angry people at the Pentagon. The machinery was already moving. Elena could feel the cold, heavy gears of the institution grinding against her. They weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in the narrative. If the project didn't exist, then Elena wasn't a hero. She was a technician who had suffered a psychological break in a combat zone and destroyed vital government property. It was a clean, efficient way to bury the failure. It protected the project, it protected the funding, and it protected the men who had signed the checks. The 3rd Battalion is still standing on that plateau, Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. Ask the commander. Ask the men who felt the ground turning into water beneath their boots. They don't need a manifest to tell them they almost died. The 3rd Battalion commander has been reassigned to a desk in Kuwait pending an administrative review, Thorne replied, his voice devoid of sympathy. The men have been told they experienced a localized seismic event exacerbated by heavy rains. Most of them are just happy to be alive. They aren't going to stick their necks out for a warrant officer they don't know, especially when the CID is asking them questions about unauthorized radio transmissions. He stood up, the stool skidding back. You're being placed under investigative hold, Vance. Your security clearance is suspended. Your access to Nipper and Sipper is revoked. You're not to speak to anyone about the events in Surobai. Not the medics, not the nurses, and especially not Corporal Miller. If you violate that order, I'll have you moved from this ward to a cell at the brig before the sun goes down. Do you understand? Elena watched him, her expression a mask of professional indifference. I understand exactly what this is, Major. You're not investigating a crime, you're surveying a landslide. Thorne didn't flinch. He just closed the folder and stepped toward the curtain. Get some rest, Chief. You're going to need it. The Article 32 hearing starts in 72 hours. And right now, the only thing the Army sees when they look at you is a $4 billion liability. He disappeared behind the blue fabric, the hiss of the curtain rings sounding like a final verdict. Elena lay back against the thin pillow, the silence of the ward pressing in on her. She was alone. The institution had done what it always did when it encountered a truth it couldn't control. It isolated it. It treated the truth like a virus, and it was currently in the process of building a quarantine. The cost was beginning to arrive in waves, more painful than the bullet wound in her shoulder. She had spent 15 years building a career based on precision, on the belief that if you mapped the world correctly, you could survive anything. Now, that map was being shredded in front of her. She wasn't just losing her rank or her reputation. She was losing her place in the only world she understood. She was a woman who defined herself by what she could do under pressure, and now the pressure was being applied by the very people she had sworn to protect. 2 hours later, the medic came in to change her dressing. He was a young specialist named Garcia, his eyes tired and his movements hurried. He didn't look at her face. He kept his focus on the wound, his fingers trembling slightly as he peeled back the tape. The skin around the stitches was a mottled purple and yellow, the exit wound a jagged star on the back of her shoulder. "Does it hurt?" Garcia asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It's manageable," Elena said. Garcia looked around the curtain, ensuring they were alone. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a point where Elena had to strain to hear him. "I was at the flight line when the 3rd Battalion guys came in. They were talking, Chief. Before the MPs shut them up. They were saying you saved them. They were saying you climbed a cliff and shut down the mountain." Elena looked at him, her eyes softening for a fraction of a second. They shouldn't be talking, specialist. It's a good way to get reassigned to Kuwait. Garcia paused, a piece of gauze in his hand. My brother is in that battalion, Alpha Company. He's got a 2-year-old daughter back in San Antonio. If he hadn't made it off that shelf, she wouldn't have a father. I don't care about the manifests, Chief. I know what you did. He finished the dressing in silence, his movements more deliberate, more respectful. He didn't say another word, but as he left, he squeezed her hand, a brief, firm pressure that spoke of a loyalty the institution couldn't touch. It was a small thing, a single data point in a sea of noise, but it was enough to keep the fire inside Elena from going out. As the night deepened over Bagram, the atmospheric weight of the base began to shift. The constant roar of the flight line, the C-17s taking off for Ramstein, the F-16s returning from the valleys to the north, became a rhythmic heartbeat. Elena lay in the dark, her mind working through the geometry of the situation. She wasn't thinking about her defense. She wasn't thinking about a lawyer. She was thinking about the map. Gathers had been right about one thing. The Sorobai project was the future. If he could turn the very earth into a weapon, he could win wars without firing a single shot. But he had forgotten the first rule of geology: you can't own the ground. You can only negotiate with it. He had tried to force the mountain to obey him, and the mountain had responded by trying to swallow him whole. She knew where the data was. She had tucked the thumb drive into the lining of her boot before they had taken her into surgery, but the boot was gone, likely processed into an evidence locker in the CID building. She didn't have the physical proof, but she had the coordinates. She had the resonance frequencies. She had the memory of the way the rock had screamed before it broke. The reckoning for Gathers was happening, but not in the way a civilian might expect. He wasn't in a dark room with a single light bulb. He was in a VIP suite at the officers' quarters, probably sipping a scotch and talking to a lawyer from the JAG Corps. But Elena knew Gathers. She knew the specific, quiet terror of a man who had seen his proof of concept turn into a disaster. He wouldn't be worried about the 3rd Battalion. He would be worried about the funding. He would be worried about the fact that the future of warfare was currently a pile of slag in a valley that shouldn't have existed. The next morning, the door to the ward opened again, but this time the footsteps were different. They were uneven, a heavy boot followed by the distinct metallic click of a limp. Elena's heart skipped a beat, though her expression remained unchanged. She knew that limp. She had tracked it across the floor of the 3rd Battalion's Tactical Operations Center. The sergeant didn't wait for a curtain. He pulled it back with a sharp jerk, his face a scarred, weathered landscape of exhaustion. He was still wearing his combat gear, though his rifle was gone and his vest was dusty. He looked at Elena, his eyes taking in the sling, the pale color of her skin, and the hard, unbreakable light in her gaze. "Chief," he said, his voice a low growl. "Sergeant," Elena replied. He walked to the end of the bed, his movements stiff. He didn't sit. He stood like a sentinel, his presence filling the small space. "They're trying to bury you, Vance. I spent 4 hours in a room with a major from CID who tried to convince me that the ground didn't actually move. He told me I was suffering from combat-induced vertigo and that my thermal footage was corrupted by atmospheric interference. Did you believe him?" The sergeant spat on the floor, a sharp, wet sound. "I've been in the Rangers for 12 years. I know what an earthquake feels like, and I know what a hero looks like. I told him to go to hell. I told him if he wanted to court-martial me for telling the truth, he could start the paperwork right then." "You shouldn't have done that," Elena said, though she felt a surge of warmth she hadn't expected. "You have a career, Sergeant. You have a team. My team is alive because of you," he said, stepping closer. "And as for my career, I'm 38 years old with a bad knee and a titanium plate in my skull. I wasn't going to make Sergeant Major anyway, but I'm not letting them turn you into a scapegoat for some suit's vanity project." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He leaned over and set it on her tray table, his hand shielding it from the view of the hallway. "Miller is in the detention barracks. They're charging him with theft of government property and unauthorized use of a secure network. They're trying to break him, Vance. They want him to say you ordered him to steal that vehicle. They want him to say you were acting out of malice." Elena looked at the paper. It was a set of coordinates written in Miller's messy, frantic hand. "What's this?" "The location of the secondary server," the sergeant whispered. Before the uplink went down, Miller managed to bounce a packet to a backup site in Bagram. It's hidden in the logistics network, masked as a warehouse inventory file. He couldn't get to it, but he says you'll know what to do with it. Elena felt a sharp, cold clarity settle over her. Miller hadn't just been a technician, he had been her partner. He had seen her clearly when everyone else was blind, and even now, under the threat of a dishonorable discharge, he was still fighting for her. He had given her the only thing that mattered, the map to the truth. "I need to get out of here," Elena said, her fingers curling around the paper. "You're not going anywhere, Chief," the sergeant said, his eyes flicking to the door. "There's an MP stationed at the end of the hall. You're on medical lockdown, but I'm still the NCOIC of the security detail for the CID building. I can't get you out, but I can make sure the right doors stay unlocked for a few minutes tonight." He looked at her then, a long, silent look that carried the weight of everything they had been through in the Surobi. It wasn't a look of pity. It was a look of recognition. He saw the extraordinary hidden capability that she had spent her life trying to manage, and for the first time he was asking her to use it. "Why are you doing this?" Elena asked. The sergeant straightened his back, his jaw setting. "Because I'm tired of watching the best people I know get broken by the worst people I know, and because I want to see the look on Gather's face when you walk into that hearing with the data." He turned and walked out, his limp sounding like a rhythmic drumbeat against the linoleum. Elena watched him go, her mind already moving past the pain in her shoulder, past the morphine fog, and into the dark, precise logic of the mission. She wasn't just a surveyor anymore. She was the one who was going to redraw the map. The hours that followed were a study in controlled patience. Elena watched the sun move across the ceiling tiles, marking the time by the shift of the shadows. She ate the bland, lukewarm hospital food without tasting it. She allowed the nurses to check her vitals, her face a mask of compliant exhaustion. She played the part of the wounded soldier, the broken woman, while her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. The Bagram logistics network was a labyrinth of legacy systems and modern encryption. To find a file masked as inventory, she would need access to a terminal with at least level 4 clearance. There was one in the head nurse's office, 50 feet down the hall. There was another in the CID annex, half a mile across the base. At 22:00, the lights in the ward were dimmed. The rhythmic thrum of the bass settled into a low, nocturnal hum. Elena waited until the night nurse, a harried captain named Miller, retreated to the break room for her hourly dose of caffeine. She sat up slowly, the movement sending a white-hot spike of agony through her shoulder. She didn't gasp. She didn't groan. She simply breathed through the pain, waiting for the world to stop spinning. She slid her feet out of the bed, the cold floor a shock against her skin. She was wearing a thin hospital gown and a pair of non-slip socks. She looked at her reflection in the small, polished metal mirror above the sink. She looked pale, her eyes shadowed, her hair a mess of sweat and dust. She looked like a casualty. But when she looked into her own eyes, she saw the woman who had stood on the ridge of the Surobi and watched the mountain break. She saw the surveyor. She saw the truth. She moved to the closet and found her uniform. It was torn and stained with blood, but it was hers. She dressed slowly, her one good hand fumbling with the buttons, her teeth gritted against the scream that wanted to escape her throat. She didn't put on the boots. She couldn't reach them without bending her shoulder, but she found her tactical sandals in the bottom of the locker. They would have to do. She stepped out of the ward, staying low and moving with the silent, fluid grace of a shadow. The hallway was empty, the only sound the distant hum of the air conditioning. She reached the head nurse's office and tried the handle. It was locked. She didn't panic. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, bent piece of wire she had scavenged from the privacy curtain. It was a crude tool, but Elena had spent her childhood in a Montana machine shop. She knew how things were built, and she knew how they were broken. 3 seconds later, the lock clicked and she slipped inside. The office was small, cluttered with files and the smell of stale coffee. The terminal sat on a metal desk, its screen glowing with a soft, amber light. Elena sat down, her fingers flying over the keys. She didn't look for the file directly. That would trigger an alert in the network security center. Instead, she looked for the gaps in the inventory. She looked for the missing parts that didn't exist, the ghost entries that Gathers had used to hide his funding. She found it at 22:45, a file marked Drone Sensors Surobi V4. It was 2 gigabytes of raw seismic data encrypted with a rolling JSOC key. Elena felt a surge of adrenaline that made her hands shake. This was it. This was the heartbeat of the mountain. This was the proof that Gathers had been playing God with the earth. She began the download, the progress bar moving with agonizing slowness. 10%, 20%, 30%. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her freeze. They were heavy, rhythmic, and coming straight toward the office. Elena didn't have time to shut down the terminal. She didn't have time to hide. She slid under the desk, her back pressed against the cold metal, her breath held in her lungs. The door opened. The light from the hallway spilled across the floor, illuminating the desk and the glowing screen. A pair of polished boots stepped into the room. Elena could see the crease in the trousers, the sharp, professional edge of a man who lived for the rules. Major Thorne. He walked to the desk and looked at the terminal. He didn't say anything. He didn't call for help. He just stood there, the silence in the room growing until it felt like it was going to shatter the walls. Elena could hear his heartbeat, or maybe it was her own, a frantic, rhythmic pounding in her ears. "I know you're in here, Vance," Thorne said, his voice quiet, almost conversational. "You're a geologist. You should know that you can't hide in a room this small. The resonance is all wrong." Elena didn't move. She didn't breathe. "The download is at 60%, Thorne continued. "In about 3 minutes, the network security team is going to see a massive data transfer from a nurse's station to an unauthorized drive. They'll be here in 5. If you leave now, I can tell them it was a glitch. I can tell them I was just checking the logs." Elena realized then that Thorne wasn't there to catch her. He was there to warn her. He was a creature of the institution, yes, but even the institution had its limits. He had seen the reports. He had seen the faces of the 3rd Battalion, and he was starting to realize that the $4 billion liability was actually the only person in the room who wasn't lying. "Why?" Elena whispered, her voice muffled by the desk. Thorne sighed, a weary, heavy sound. "Because my father was in the 1st Infantry Division. He was at the Aya Drang Valley. He told me once that the hardest part of being an officer isn't making the right decision, it's living with the wrong one. I don't want to live with this one, Vance." He turned and walked toward the door. "You have 2 minutes. After that, I'm calling it in. If you're still here, I can't help you." He stepped out and closed the door, the click of the lock sounding like a starting gun. Elena scrambled out from under the desk, her shoulders screaming in protest. She watched the progress bar, 85%, 90%, 95%, 100%. She pulled the thumb drive from the port and slipped it into her pocket. She didn't wait for the terminal to shut down. She didn't wait for the security team. She slipped out of the office and into the secondary service tunnel that led to the laundry facility. The night air of Bagram was cold and sharp, a welcome shock after the stifling heat of the hospital. Elena stayed in the shadows, her mind focused on the next coordinate. She needed to get to Miller. She needed to tell him that they had the map. But the institution wasn't done with her. As she rounded the corner of the motor pool, a pair of headlights cut through the dark, blinding her. A siren wailed, a sharp, piercing sound that tore through the quiet of the base. "Halt!" A voice roared over a loudspeaker. "Stay where you are, hands in the air." Elena didn't run, she didn't hide. She stood her ground, the thumb drive clutched in her hand, the weight of the truth finally balancing the scales. She looked into the glare of the lights, her face a mask of controlled, unwavering defiance. The reckoning had arrived. But this time she wasn't the one who was going to be buried. The MPs swarmed her, their movements rough and practiced. They forced her to the ground, the impact sending a wave of agony through her shoulder that finally broke through her control. She gasped, a sharp, ragged sound, but she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply closed her eyes and held onto the thumb drive, her fingers locked around it like a lifeline. They took her to the detention barracks, a low, concrete building on the far edge of the base. It smelled of mildew and stale sweat, the air heavy with the specific, crushing weight of confinement. They stripped her of her uniform, gave her a pair of orange coveralls, and locked her in a cell that was 6 feet wide and 8 feet long. There was no bed, just a thin plastic mat on the floor. There was no window, just a small, barred vent near the ceiling. Elena sat on the mat, her back against the cold wall, and she watched the light from the hallway flicker beneath the door. She was in the hole, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was on solid ground. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. The time in the hole had a way of stretching and folding, a geological process that turned minutes into eons. Elena didn't sleep. She didn't eat the tasteless mush they slid through the door. She simply waited, her mind repeating the coordinates of the Serobi, the frequency of the pulse, the names of the men she had saved. On the 3rd day, the door opened. It wasn't Thorne. It wasn't the sergeant. It was Colonel Gathers. He was wearing his class A uniform, his medals gleaming, his silver eagles looking like predatory birds on his shoulders. He looked older, more tired, but his eyes were still filled with the same cold, professional arrogance that had nearly destroyed a battalion. He walked into the cell and stood over Elena, his presence a suffocating weight. "You've caused a lot of trouble, Vance," Gathers said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "The Pentagon is breathing down my neck. The JSOC commander is asking questions about unauthorized seismic experiments. And you're sitting in a cell holding onto a thumb drive that doesn't exist." Elena looked up at him, her gaze unflinching. "If the drive doesn't exist, why are you here, Colonel? Why aren't you in Washington, accepting your medal for the Sorobai project?" Gathers smiled, a thin, mirthless line. "Because I'm a patriot, Elena, and a patriot knows that sometimes the truth is a luxury we can't afford. The project was the future. It would have saved thousands of American lives, and you destroyed it because you couldn't handle the cost." "The cost was 300 men," Elena said, her voice dropping to a point that made Gathers flinch. "Men who trusted you, men who thought you were their commander, not their executioner. They're soldiers," Gathers snapped, his control finally slipping. "They signed up to die for their country, whether it's by a bullet or a mountain shouldn't matter to them." "It matters to the ground," Elena said. "It matters to the truth." Gathers leaned in close, his breath smelling of peppermint and stale coffee. "There is no truth, Vance. There is only the report. And the report says that you are a mentally unstable technician who sabotaged a vital mission. The report says that I tried to stop you. The report says that you're going to spend the rest of your life in a military prison." He reached out and grabbed her chin, his fingers digging into her skin. "Give me the drive, Elena. Give it to me, and I'll make sure you get a quiet discharge. I'll make sure you get the medical help you clearly need. Don't throw your life away for a map that no one will ever see." Elena looked at him, her eyes filled with a dark, terrifying competence that made Gathers pull his hand back. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The silence in the cell was louder than any argument. It was the silence of the mountain before it broke. It was the silence of a woman who had already decided what her life was worth. Gathers stood up, his face a mask of fury. "Fine, have it your way. The hearing starts at 0800 tomorrow. Enjoy the dark, Vance. It's the only place you're ever going to be right again." He slammed the door, the sound echoing through the barracks like a gunshot. Elena sat back against the wall, her breath coming in slow, even rhythms. She felt the thumb drive beneath the plastic mat, its sharp edges a comfort against her leg. She wasn't afraid of the dark. She was a surveyor. She had spent her life learning how to see in the places where other people were blind. And she knew that no matter how deep they buried her, the truth would always find a way to the surface. The morning of the hearing arrived with a cold, gray light that filtered through the vent in the ceiling. Elena was taken from her cell, handcuffed, and led through the base to the JAG building. She was flanked by 4 MPs, their faces grim, their movements mechanical. She didn't look at them. She didn't look at the soldiers who stopped to watch her pass. She kept her eyes on the horizon, on the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush that were still glowing with the first light of the sun. The hearing room was small, sterile, and filled with the heavy scent of old paper and floor wax. At the front of the room sat a panel of 3 officers, a colonel from the JAG Corps, a lieutenant colonel from the Corps of Engineers, and a major general from JSOC. They looked like statues, their faces devoid of emotion, their eyes fixed on the folders in front of them. Gathers was already there, sitting at the prosecution table with a team of lawyers. He looked confident, his chin held high, his hands folded neatly on the table. He didn't look at Elena as she was led to the defense table, where a young, harried-looking captain was waiting for her. "I'm Captain Holloway," the lawyer whispered as Elena sat down. "I've reviewed your file, Vance. It's not good. They've got witnesses, manifests, and a psychiatric evaluation that says you're suffering from acute stress disorder." "Do you have the drive?" Elena asked, her voice a quiet, steady sound. Holloway blinked, his eyes widening. "The drive? You mean the one you were caught with? CID has it. It's evidence." "No," Elena said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "They have the drive I wanted them to find, the one that's filled with encrypted nonsense. I have the real one." She reached into her pocket, or where her pocket would have been if she were still in her uniform. Instead, she reached into the waistband of her coveralls and pulled out a small, flat piece of plastic. She had spent the night in her cell carefully transferring the data to a secondary micro SD card she had scavenged from her own GPS unit weeks ago, hidden inside the heel of her tactical sandal. "Put this into the terminal," Elena whispered, sliding the card across the table. "Don't ask questions, just do it." Holloway looked at the card, then at Elena, his expression a mix of terror and awe. He was a young officer, a man who had spent his career following the rules, but in that moment he saw the extraordinary hidden capability of the woman sitting next to him. He saw the surveyor who had mapped the fire. "I could lose my commission for this," Holloway whispered. "You could save 300 men," Elena replied. The hearing began with the dry, rhythmic reading of the charges: destruction of government property, theft, sabotage, unauthorized use of a secure network. To the panel of officers, it sounded like an open and shut case. Gathers was called to the stand first, and he told his story with the practiced ease of a master orator. He spoke of the Project Sorobai as a humanitarian effort to stabilize the valley. He spoke of Elena's instability and her unprovoked attack on the facility. He spoke of his own heroic efforts to save the 3rd Battalion from the disaster that she had caused. It was a perfect lie. It was a map of a world that didn't exist, drawn by a man who had forgotten that the ground always remembers. When it was Elena's turn to speak, she didn't stand up. She didn't make a speech. She simply looked at the Major General from JSOC, her eyes locking onto his. "Colonel Gathers is right about one thing," Elena said, her voice clear and steady. "The Sorobai project was the future, but it wasn't a humanitarian effort. It was a weapon, and I have the coordinates to prove it." She nodded to Holloway. The young captain, his hands shaking, inserted the micro SD card into the terminal on the desk. He hit a key, and the screens on the wall flickered to life. It wasn't a report. It wasn't a manifest. It was a 3-dimensional rendering of the Sorobai Valley, a glowing, skeletal map of the Earth itself. On the screen, the hydraulic pulse was visible as a series of rhythmic red ripples spreading out from the hangar and into the limestone shelf. The data was raw, visceral, and undeniable. It showed the ground turning to water. It showed the 3rd Battalion sitting in the center of the kill zone. And it showed the command signal originating from Gather's private terminal that had triggered the final collapse. The room went silent. The Major General stood up, his face turning a deep, angry shade of red. He looked at the screen, then at Gathers, who had gone pale, his confident mask shattering like glass. "What the hell is this, Colonel?" the General roared. Gathers tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. He looked at Elena, and for the first time he saw her. He saw the woman he had dismissed, the woman he had tried to bury. He saw the map lady. The institutional response was immediate and devastating. The hearing was adjourned. The room was cleared. Elena was taken back to her cell, but this time the MPs didn't touch her. They stood at the door, their eyes averted, their bodies tense. 2 hours later, Major Thorne arrived. He wasn't carrying a folder. He was carrying a set of clean ACUs and her boots. "The General wants to see you, Vance," Thorne said, his voice quiet. "The 3rd Battalion commander is on a flight back from Kuwait, and Colonel Gathers, he's being escorted to the brig." Elena didn't say anything. She simply dressed, her movements slow and deliberate. She put on the boots, the solid weight of them a comfort against the floor. She felt the ache in her shoulder, the exhaustion in her bones, the cost of everything she had done. She walked out of the detention barracks and into the light of the Bagram afternoon. The sun was high, the sky a brilliant, heartbreaking blue. She looked toward the mountains, toward the Sorobai, and she felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any victory. She had found the hidden thing. She had mapped the fire, and she had held the ground. The institutional reckoning was just beginning. There would be more hearings, more reports, more attempts to bury the truth in a new layer of paperwork. But as Elena Vance walked toward the General's office, she knew that she had already won. She had saved the men. She had corrected the map, and for a woman like her, that was the only reckoning that mattered. She was Elena Vance. She was a surveyor, and she was still standing. But as she reached the door to the General's office, she stopped. She looked at her hands, which were still stained with the dust of the valley. She looked at the thumb drive that Thorne had returned to her, the small plastic thing that held the truth of the world. She didn't go inside. She turned and walked toward the flight line, toward the C-17 that was waiting to take her back to the world she had left behind. "Chief Vance," Thorne called out, his voice echoing across the tarmac. "Where are you going? The General is waiting." Elena didn't look back. She kept walking, her head up, her eyes on the horizon. "I'm done with the reports, Major," she said, her voice a quiet, dangerous sound. "I'm going back to the ground." She stepped onto the plane, the roar of the engines swallowing her whole. She didn't look back at the base. She didn't look back at the institution. She looked at the map in her mind, the one that showed the way home. She was the fire, and the fire was finally free. But as the plane lifted off, Elena felt a sudden, sharp vibration in her teeth. It was subtle, a hum that lived in the bones, the same frequency she had felt in the hangar. She looked out the window at the valley floor below, and she saw it. A single, rhythmic ripple in the sand, moving away from the base and toward the mountains. The project wasn't dead. Gathers was gone, but the mountain was still speaking. Elena Vance leaned back against the seat, her fingers curling around the thumb drive. She wasn't done yet. The map was still being drawn, and the map lady was the only one who knew where the next fault line was going to be. The vibration didn't stop when the C-17 Globemaster cleared the jagged, snow-dusted teeth of the Hindu Kush. It stayed in the soles of Elena's boots, a persistent, low-frequency thrum that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to the fluid in her inner ear. To the 18 other soldiers strapped into the red nylon jump seats, most of them walking wounded with bandages wrapped around heads or arms. It was just the mechanical protest of a heavy transport fighting the thin, high-altitude air. To Elena, it was a ghost. It was the echo of the Surobai mountain, a phantom resonance that felt like the earth itself was trying to follow her home. She sat with her back against the vibrating fuselage, her left arm strapped tightly across her chest in a fresh medical sling, her eyes closed. She wasn't sleeping. She was measuring. She was calculating the distance between the woman who had arrived in Afghanistan with a laser transit and a sense of duty, and the woman who was leaving it with a bullet hole in her shoulder and a piece of plastic in her pocket that could set the Pentagon on fire. The interior of the plane smelled of hydraulic fluid, sweat, and the metallic tang of dried blood. It was a sensory cocktail she had lived in for years, but now it felt suffocating. Every time the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, the man sitting next to her, a young specialist from the 10th Mountain Division with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw, would flinch, his hand twitching toward a rifle that wasn't there anymore. Elena watched him through the periphery of her vision. He was a survivor of the shelf. He didn't know her name, and he would never know that she was the reason the ground hadn't finished swallowing his platoon, but he looked at her once, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, and nodded. It was a silent, reflexive recognition of a shared weight. In the military, you didn't need to speak to know who had been to the edge and looked over. The flight to Ramstein was a blur of gray light and the rhythmic clatter of the crew chief's moving pallets. Elena spent the hours tracing the topography of her own wreckage. Her career as a warrant officer was, for all intents and purposes, over. The CID hold had been lifted for medical transport, a procedural sleight of hand that meant the institution was moving the problem from a combat zone to a controlled environment. Gathers was in a cell in Bagram, but Gathers was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was the ambition that had allowed a $4 billion geological solution to be tested on live American troops. As the plane banked over the Atlantic, the sun began to bleed across the horizon, a sharp, cold orange that reminded her of the magnesium fires in the hangar. She reached into the small, hidden pocket she had sewn into the waistband of her civilian cargo pants, the ones the nurses had given her from the donation bin, and felt the sharp edge of the micro SD card. It was small, light. It weighed less than a penny, but it carried the mass of 300 lives. The landing at Dover Air Force Base was unceremonious. There were no cameras, no greeting parties, and no medals. It was 0300, and the Delaware air was thick with a damp, coastal chill that seeped into Elena's stitches like a needle. She was processed through the terminal with the efficiency of a logistics part. A bored airman checked her ID, noted the medical/pending administrative review status on his screen, and pointed her toward a nondescript white van waiting near the perimeter fence. There was no MP escort this time. The institution had shifted tactics. They weren't treating her like a criminal anymore. They were treating her like a secret. The driver of the van was a man in his 50s wearing a charcoal suit and the kind of generic government tissue haircut that screamed intelligence. He didn't offer to help her with her small bag. He didn't ask her how she was feeling. He simply waited for her to slide into the back seat and then pulled away from the flight line, the tires humming on the asphalt. "You're being taken to a transition facility in Arlington, Chief," the man said, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "A doctor will see you, a lawyer will see you, and then a man who doesn't exist will see you." Elena leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. The American suburbs rolled by, gas stations, 24-hour diners, the flickering neon of a world that had no idea the ground beneath it was a variable. "What happens to the 3rd Battalion?" she asked, her voice sounding like gravel. "The 3rd is being refitted at Fort Carson," the driver replied. "Their records will show they encountered an unconventional seismic event during a high-altitude training exercise. They're getting extra leave. Their families are being told it was a miracle they survived the landslide. Everyone is happy, Vance. except for the people who have to balance the books. The books aren't balanced, Elena said, her eyes narrowing as they passed a sign for Washington, D.C. They're just being rewritten. The transition facility was a refurbished hotel on the outskirts of Arlington, the kind of place where the windows didn't open and the carpets smelled of industrial lemon. Elena was given a room on the 4th floor. The television was bolted to the wall. The phone had no outside line. For 3 days, she lived in a state of suspended animation. A military surgeon came in to change her dressings, his hands steady and his face a mask of professional silence. A JAG captain sat with her for 4 hours, his legal pad filled with questions about unauthorized data procurement and chain of command violations. He spoke in the language of damage mitigation. He wasn't there to defend her. He was there to find out how much she was willing to trade for her life. On the 4th night, the door opened, and a man walked in who didn't look like a soldier or a lawyer. He was older, his face etched with the weary lines of a man who had spent 40 years making uncomfortable things go away. He carried 2 cups of coffee from a nearby Starbucks and sat in the plastic chair by the window. He didn't introduce himself. "The general says you're a hell of a surveyor, Elena," the man said, sliding a cup toward her. "He says you see things the satellites miss. He also says you're the most stubborn woman he's ever had the displeasure of trying to protect." Elena didn't touch the coffee. She sat on the edge of the bed, her posture straight, her one good hand resting on her knee. "I'm not looking for protection." "Good," the man said, taking a slow sip of his own drink. "Because the kind of protection you'd need to stay in the army doesn't exist anymore. The Sorobi project was a mistake. A massive, expensive, catastrophic mistake, but it was also a prototype. There are people in this city who believe that the only way to stay ahead of the next conflict is to own the environment. They don't care about the 3rd Battalion. They care about the next 10 years. They want the data back, Elena, all of it." "The data is a death sentence," Elena said. "The mountain told us that. Gathers tried to force the rock to vibrate at a frequency it couldn't sustain. He wasn't weaponizing the earth. He was breaking the foundation. If you keep going, you're not going to win a war. You're going to collapse the theater." The man leaned forward, the light from the street lamp outside catching the gray in his hair. "I know. I've read your report, the one you managed to bounce through the logistics network before the MPs caught you. It's brilliant, it's terrifying, and it's the reason you're sitting in this room instead of a cell in Leavenworth. We don't want to continue the project, Elena. We want to bury it. We want to make sure no one else, not the Russians, not the Chinese, not even our own R&D boys, ever tries to pull that trigger again. But to do that, we need the master key. We need the raw seismic logs you took from the hangar." "And what do I get?" Elena asked. "A medal, a thank you for your service." The man laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "You get to walk away. Your medical discharge will be processed as honorable. Your pension will be intact. The 3rd Battalion's records will remain clean. No administrative reviews, no lost promotions. They get to go home to their wives and kids with their dignity. And you get to go back to Montana. You get to be the woman who knows the truth but never has to speak it again. It's the best deal you're ever going to get." Elena looked at him, her mind working through the geometry of the trade. It was the ultimate institutional bargain, her silence for their survival. If she released the data to the press, she would be a whistleblower for a week, and then she would be a casualty of the legal system. The 3rd Battalion would be dragged through the mud. The project would be rebranded and moved to another black site. But if she gave it to this man, she could ensure the men she saved stayed saved. She could protect the only family she had ever really known, the soldiers who stood on the line. "I want it in writing," Elena said, her voice cold. "The 3rd Battalion status, Corporal Miller's record, everything." "It's already done," the man said, reaching into his coat and pulling out a thick, sealed envelope. "Miller was released this morning. He's being reassigned to a signals unit in Hawaii. He thinks he got lucky. We'll let him keep thinking that." Elena reached into the waistband of her pants and pulled out the micro SD card. It looked so small against the backdrop of the Arlington skyline. She set it on the table between them. The man didn't grab it. He looked at it for a long moment, then nodded. "You're a good soldier, Vance," he said, standing up. "A better one than this country deserves." "I'm not a soldier anymore," Elena said. "I'm just a woman who knows where the bodies are buried." The man took the card, pocketed it, and left the room without another word. The silence that followed was different than the silence of the hospital or the cell. It was the silence of a closed door. The mission was over. The cost had been paid. 3 days later, Elena was standing on the curb at Dulles International Airport, her small bag over her shoulder. She was wearing a denim jacket and jeans, her arms still in the sling, but hidden beneath the fabric. She looked like any other traveler, another face in the sea of Americans returning from a long trip. She bought a one-way ticket to Billings, Montana. The flight across the heartland of America was a study in perspective. From 30,000 feet, the world looked like a map she had spent her life trying to master. She saw the geometric precision of the Midwest farms, the winding arteries of the Missouri River, and finally, the rising, jagged purple of the Rockies. It was a beautiful, indifferent landscape. It didn't care about frequencies or hydraulic pulses. It just was. When she landed in Billings, the air was dry and smelled of sagebrush and distant rain. It was the smell of her childhood, the smell of the ground she had first learned to measure with her father's old surveying chains. She rented a battered Ford F-150 and began the long drive south, toward the high plains where the mountains met the sky. She didn't go to her father's house. She went to a small, isolated cabin she had bought years ago with her deployment pay, a place tucked into a fold of the earth near the Gallatin National Forest. It was a simple structure, one room, a wood stove, and a porch that looked out over a vast, golden valley. She spent the first week in a state of physical and emotional exhaustion. Her shoulder ached with a dull, throbbing persistence, a reminder of the Surobi that would stay with her forever. She moved slowly, her body relearning the rhythms of a world without sirens or rotors. She chopped wood with her right arm, the repetitive motion a kind of therapy. She sat on the porch for hours, watching the shadows of the clouds move across the grass, her mind finally starting to quiet. On the 10th day, a truck pulled up the long, gravel driveway. Elena didn't reach for a rifle. She stood up, her hand resting on the porch railing, her eyes narrowed against the sun. The truck was a dusty, black Silverado with a Ranger sticker on the back window. The man who climbed out was wearing a flannel shirt and work boots, but his gait was unmistakable. It was the sergeant. He looked different without the body armor and the dust, but the scars on his face were the same, and the way he scanned the perimeter was a habit he would never break. He walked up to the porch and stopped, looking at Elena with a quiet, unreadable expression. "Nice place, Vance," he said, his voice the same low growl she remembered. "How did you find me, Sergeant?" Elena asked. "I'm a ranger," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Finding people who don't want to be found is half the job. The other half is knowing when to stay away. I figured 10 days was enough time for you to stop looking for a fight." He reached into the bed of his truck and pulled out a small cooler. "I heard you were medically retired. I figured you might be thirsty." They sat on the porch in the deepening afternoon light, drinking cold beers and watching the wind move through the tall grass. For a long time, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were the only two people in this world who knew the true history of the Surobi, the only ones who had seen the mountain scream and lived to tell the tale. "They tried to give me a commendation medal," the sergeant said, staring out at the horizon, "for exceptional leadership during a localized natural disaster. I told them to shove it. I told them if they wanted to honor someone, they should put your name on the wall at the Pentagon." "That wall is for people who died," Elena said, taking a sip of her beer. "I'm not dead yet." "No," the sergeant said, looking at her. "But you're not the same either. None of us are. I saw Miller before he left for Hawaii. He's okay. He's twitchy as hell, but he's okay. He asked about you. I told him you were somewhere the ground didn't move." Elena looked down at her hands. "The ground always moves, Sergeant. We just usually aren't listening." "The 3rd is back at Carson," he continued. "Most of the guys are out. Disability, career changes, some just walked away. They're calling themselves the Shelf Survivors. They have a drink every Friday night at a bar off base. They leave an empty chair at the end of the table. For you." Elena felt a lump in her throat, a sudden, sharp surge of emotion she had been holding back since the moment she had stepped into the hangar in Bagram. She didn't let it break her. She just tightened her grip on the bottle, her knuckles turning white. "They don't owe me anything," she said. "They know that," the sergeant replied. "That's why they do it." He stayed for 2 hours. They talked about things that didn't matter, the price of lumber, the elk season, the way the weather was changing. When he finally got back into his truck, he leaned out the window and looked at her one last time. "You ever get tired of the silence, Chief, you let me know. I'm living over in Bozeman, working for a private security firm. It's boring as hell, but the coffee is better than the TOC." "I'll remember that," Elena said. She watched his taillights disappear down the driveway, the dust settling back onto the gravel. She was alone again, but the silence didn't feel as heavy as it had before. It felt like a foundation. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. Elena went inside and lit the wood stove, the smell of pine smoke filling the cabin. She sat at the small wooden table she had built herself and pulled a topographic map of the Gallatin Valley from a drawer. She laid it out under the soft light of a kerosene lamp, her fingers tracing the contour lines. She wasn't looking for minerals. She wasn't looking for weapons. She was just looking at the earth. She realized then that the man in the suit had been wrong about one thing. She hadn't given him the master key. The micro SD card had contained the raw data, the logs, the command signals, everything they needed to bury the project. But the real key wasn't on a piece of plastic. It was in her head. It was the intuitive understanding of the way the rock resonated, the way the pressure built before the break, the language of the lithosphere that she had spent 15 years learning to speak. Gathers had tried to use that language to destroy. Elena would use it to listen. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, handheld seismic monitor she had managed to keep in her personal gear. It was a civilian model meant for hikers and amateur geologists. She stepped out onto the porch and knelt down, pressing the sensor against the cold, hard-packed dirt of the Montana soil. She closed her eyes and waited. At first, there was nothing but the background noise of the world, the wind in the trees, the distant hum of a highway, the beating of her own heart. But then she felt it. A faint, rhythmic pulse deep within the crust. It wasn't the violent, artificial scream of the Surobi. It was the natural heartbeat of the planet, the slow, tectonic shift of a world that was constantly remaking itself. It was beautiful, it was terrifying, and it was the truth. Elena Vance sat on the edge of her porch, the surveyor who had found her way home. She was a woman who had been dismissed, betrayed, and broken by the institution she had served. But she had come out the other side with something they could never take away. She knew the secret of the ground. She knew that no matter how much man tried to dominate the earth always had the final word. She thought about the 3rd Battalion, sitting in that bar in Colorado, leaving a chair empty for a woman they didn't know. She thought about Miller watching the Pacific waves and wondering if the ground was still solid. She thought about Gathers, sitting in a cell, still believing he could have owned the mountain. The cost had been high. She would never wear the uniform again. She would never walk without a twinge of pain in her shoulder. She would carry the weight of the Surobi until the day she died. But as she sat there in the dark, listening to the earth breathe, she knew she would pay it all again. She was the watchman. She was the one who listened when everyone else was deaf. She was the map lady. The years that followed were quiet, but they weren't empty. Elena became a legend in the local community, the woman who lived on the ridge and could tell you when a storm was coming 48 hours before the weather service. She never talked about her time in the military. She never mentioned Afghanistan. She just worked her small piece of land, fixed her own truck, and occasionally helped the Forest Service map the shifting fault lines in the backcountry. Sometimes, at night, she would dream of the Surobi. She would see the magnesium fire and feel the ground turning to water. She would see the faces of the men on the shelf, their eyes filled with the primal terror of a world coming apart. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart hammering in her chest, her hand reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. But then, she would step out onto her porch and feel the solid, unchanging weight of the Montana rock beneath her feet. She would look up at the stars, the same stars that had watched over her in the desert, and she would breathe. She would remember that the mountain hadn't one. She had. In the autumn of her 3rd year back, she received a package in the mail. It had no return address, and the postmark was from a small town in Hawaii. Inside was a single, framed photograph. It was a picture of a little girl, maybe 5 years old, sitting on a swing set and laughing. On the back, in a familiar, messy hand, were 4 words, *, she has a father. *, Elena held the photo for a long time, the paper warm in her hand. She didn't cry, but she felt a tightness in her chest that was the closest she had come to it in years. It was the final data point, the last calculation, the proof that the mission had been a success. She put the photo on her mantle, next to her father's old transit and a piece of white limestone she had brought back from the Surobi. It was a small collection, a record of a life defined by precision and pressure. As the first snow of the season began to fall, Elena Vance stood on her porch and watched the world turn white. The flakes were large and wet, sticking to the golden grass and the dark bark of the pines. It was a quiet, peaceful transformation, a layer of silence being laid over the earth. She felt the familiar, low-frequency hum in her feet. It wasn't a threat. It was a greeting. She was Elena Vance. She was a surveyor. She was a daughter of Montana and a survivor of the Surobi. She was a woman who had seen the hidden thing and chose to protect it. She turned and went inside, closing the door against the cold. The fire in the stove was burning bright, the wood popping and hissing as it gave up its heat. She sat in her chair and picked up a book, the light of the lamp casting long, steady shadows across the room. Outside, the mountains waited. The fault lines shifted. The earth breathed. And in a small cabin on a ridge in Montana, the only person who knew how to listen was finally at peace. She had done what she was trained to do. She had mapped the fire, she had found the way through, and she had held the ground until the very end. The report was wrong, but the truth was written in the rock. She lived in a country that would never know her name, in an institution that had tried to bury her, on a planet that didn't care about her existence. But as she closed her eyes and let the warmth of the fire pull her towards sleep, she knew that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was the foundation. The vibration in the ground was subtle, a rhythmic pulse that only she could feel, a secret language shared between the woman and the world. It was a good day to be alive. The snow continued to fall, covering the valley in a thick white blanket, erasing the roads and the fences and the boundaries that men had drawn on the map. It was a clean slate, a new topography. Elena Vance slept, her hand resting on the arm of the chair, her breathing synchronized with the heartbeat of the earth. She was the map lady, and she was home. But deep in the basement of a nondescript building in Northern Virginia, a computer terminal flickered to life. A red light began to pulse on a map of the world, centered on a remote valley in the Hindu Kush. A technician leaned forward, his brow furrowed as he watched the waveforms. "Sir," the technician said, his voice echoing in the sterile room. "The Surobi site, it's active again." The man in the charcoal suit stood behind him, his eyes fixed on the screen. He thought about the micro SD card in his safe, and then he thought about the woman in Montana. He knew she had given him what he asked for. He also knew she had kept the one thing that mattered. "Leave it," the man said, his voice a weary, heavy sound. "There's only one person who can read that map, and she's not on the payroll anymore." He turned and walked out of the room, the silence of the institution closing in behind him. The red light continued to pulse, a lonely, rhythmic signal in the dark. It was a warning, a call, a question. But in the high plains of Montana, the woman on the ridge didn't hear it. She was busy listening to the silence. She knew that the mountain was still there. She knew that the fire was still burning. But she also knew that as long as she was standing, the ground would never break again without her knowing it first. She was the surveyor of the secret places. The wind picked up, howling through the pines and rattling the windows of the cabin. Elena didn't wake up. She just shifted in her sleep, her fingers curling as if she were holding a pen, ready to mark the next coordinate. The world was a complicated, dangerous, beautiful place, and Elena Vance was the only one who had the map. She had earned her rest. She had paid the cost, and as the snow piled up against the door, she finally let go of the mission. She was just Elena now, and that was enough. The fire in the stove flickered and died, leaving only a bed of glowing red coals. The cabin grew cold, but Elena didn't feel it. She was somewhere else, somewhere where the air was clear and the ground was solid, and the only thing she had to measure was the distance between herself and the horizon. She was free. The institutional gears continued to grind, the reports continued to be written, and the world continued to spin on its axis, oblivious to the woman who had saved it. But in the quiet of the Montana night, the truth remained. It was written in the scars on her shoulder. It was written in the photo on her mantle. It was written in the very marrow of her bones. She had held the ground. The last of the coals turned to ash, and the room went dark. The only light came from the moon, reflecting off the snow and spilling through the window like a silver tide. It illuminated the map on the table, the one Elena had been studying before she fell asleep. It was a map of the Gallatin Valley, but she had added her own marks. Small, precise symbols that indicated the hidden springs, the ancient rock slides, the places where the earth felt thin. It was a work in progress, a life's work. She was still mapping the fire. The wind died down and the silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. It was the silence of a world at rest, a world that had forgotten its own fragility. But Elena Vance remembered. She would always remember. She was the map lady, and as long as she was alive, the mountain would never have the last word. She was the sentinel, the witness, the survivor. The institution had tried to bury her, but they had only succeeded in planting a seed. And now, in the fertile soil of Montana, that seed had grown into something they could never control. She was the extraordinary hidden capability of the American spirit. The sun began to rise over the eastern peaks, a pale, cold light that turned the snow to gold. Elena Vance opened her eyes and looked at the world, her gaze clear and unflinching. She felt the vibration in the floor, the rhythmic pulse of the earth. She stood up, stretched her stiff limbs, and walked to the window. The valley was beautiful, a pristine white expanse that stretched out toward the horizon. It was a new day, a new map. She reached for her jacket, her hands steady, her heart calm. She had work to do. She stepped out onto the porch, the cold air a sharp, welcome shock. She looked at the ground, at the footprints she had made the day before, and she smiled. She was still here. The mountain was gone. The project was buried. The mission was over. But the earth was still speaking, and Elena Vance was still listening. She walked down the steps and into the snow, her boots making a soft, rhythmic sound as she headed toward the ridge. She wasn't looking back. She was looking forward toward the places where the map was still blank. She was a surveyor, and a surveyor never stops until the last line is drawn. She reached the top of the ridge and stopped, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She looked out over the vast, beautiful, dangerous landscape of America, and she felt a sense of pride that was deeper than any rank or medal. She had protected this. She had saved the people who lived here, even if they would never know her name. She was a soldier of the shadows, a guardian of the ground. She pulled her handheld monitor from her pocket and pressed it against a flat, exposed piece of granite. She waited for the signal, for the heartbeat, for the truth. It came steady and strong. The ground was solid. Elena Vance stood on the ridge, a solitary figure against the vastness of the sky. She was the map lady, and she was exactly where she belonged. The vibration in the rock was a secret she would keep forever, a promise between the woman and the earth. She turned and began the walk back to the cabin, her stride long and confident. She had a fire to build. She had a life to live. She had a world to watch over. The institutional reports would say that she had disappeared. They would say that she was a liability that had been successfully mitigated. They would say that the Surobi was a closed chapter. They were wrong. The Surobi was a memory, but the map lady was a reality. And in the quiet, snowy heart of Montana, the reality was all that mattered. She reached her front door and paused, looking back at the ridge one last time. The sun was fully up now, the valley glowing with a brilliant, blinding light. It was a perfect day for a survey. She went inside and closed the door, the click of the lock a final, satisfied sound. She was home, and the ground was still. She sat at her table, picked up her pen, and began to draw the first line of the new map. She was the surveyor, and she was finally done with the fire. The silence of the cabin was the only commendation she needed. She worked through the morning, her hands steady, her mind clear. She was mapping the quiet places now, the places where the world was at peace. It was a good map, the best she had ever made. And as she finished the last line, she realized that she wasn't just mapping the land anymore, she was mapping herself. The cost had been paid, the mission was complete, the fire was out. Elena Vance laid down her pen and looked at the work she had done. It was precise, it was honest, it was true. It was the map of a woman who had seen the worst of the world and still chose to love the ground beneath her feet. She was the map lady, and she was home. The snow continued to fall, a soft, silent blessing on the high plains of Montana. She stood up, walked to the stove, and added another log to the fire. The heat bloomed, a warm, comforting presence in the quiet room. Elena Vance sat by the window and watched the world disappear into the white, her heart as steady as the mountain she had left behind. She was a soldier, she was a surveyor, she was a woman of the earth, and for the first time in a long, long time, she was exactly who she wanted to be. The vibration in the floor was gone, replaced by the steady, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. It was the sound of time passing, the sound of a life being lived, the sound of peace. She closed her eyes and let the silence take her, a final, beautiful surrender to the world she had saved. She was the map lady, and she was home. The institution was 1,000 miles away. The Surobi was a ghost. The fire was a memory, but the ground was real, and the ground was solid. She breathed in the smell of pine and cold air, a deep, satisfied breath that filled her lungs and quieted her soul. She was done. The final coordinate had been found. The map was complete. And as the sun reached its zenith, casting no shadows on the white landscape below, Elena Vance finally let the world go. She was free. The silence of the Montana high country was the only thing she heard, a vast, beautiful emptiness that was filled with the promise of tomorrow. She was a woman who knew the truth, and the truth had set her free. She was the map lady, and she was home. The snow drifted against the cabin walls, burying the past in a thick white shroud. Elena Vance slept, the surveyor who had found her own way back to the center of the world. She was the foundation, and the foundation was strong. She woke up as the light began to fade, the shadows lengthening across the room. She felt the familiar, dull ache in her shoulder, but it was just a physical thing now, a part of her body like the color of her eyes or the shape of her hands. She stood up and walked to the mantel, looking at the photo of the little girl on the swing. "You're welcome," she whispered, her voice a soft, steady sound in the quiet room. She turned and went into the kitchen to make herself some dinner. She moved with a quiet, efficient grace, the movements of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. She didn't need the uniform. She didn't need the rank. She didn't need the validation of the men who had tried to break her. She had the ground. And as she sat down to eat, the stars began to come out, one by one, lighting up the dark Montana sky like 1,000 silent beacons. She looked out the window and smiled. It was a beautiful night, a perfect night for a surveyor. She finished her meal, cleaned her dishes, and prepared for bed. She moved through the house with a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. She was the map lady, and she was home. The last thing she did before she turned out the lamp was to check the seismic monitor one last time. It was flat. The world was quiet. She lay down in her bed, the quilts heavy and warm against her skin. She closed her eyes and felt the rhythmic beating of her own heart, a steady, unwavering pulse that was the only frequency that mattered. She was alive. She was home, and she was free. The snow fell through the night, a soft, silent witness to the woman on the ridge. Elena Vance slept, her mind finally clear of the fire and the mountain and the cost of the truth. She was the surveyor, and she had found her way home. The institutional reports were filed away in dark rooms, the names were forgotten, and the secrets were buried in layers of bureaucracy. But in the quiet, snowy heart of Montana, the truth remained. It was written in the snow. It was written in the stars. It was written in the woman. She was the map lady, and the ground was solid. The morning came with a brilliant, blinding light, the sun reflecting off the snow like 1,000 diamonds. Elena Vance stepped out onto her porch and breathed in the cold, clear air. She looked at the ridge, then at the valley, then at the sky. It was a new day. She was ready. She walked down the steps and into the white, her boots making a soft, rhythmic sound as she headed toward the horizon. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Everything she had ever lost was behind her, and everything she had ever earned was right here beneath her feet. She was Elena Vance, and she was home. The wind blew across the high plains, carrying the scent of sage and pine and the distant, cold promise of winter. She kept walking, her head up, her eyes on the line where the earth met the sky. She was the map lady, and she was still standing. The vibration in the ground was gone, replaced by the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a woman who had found her peace. She was the foundation, and the foundation was strong. The silence of the Montana morning was the only thing she needed to hear. She was home, she was free, and the map was finally complete. Elena Vance reached the top of the ridge and stood looking out over the world, a solitary figure in a vast, white landscape. She felt the sun on her face and the cold wind in her hair. She was alive, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She took one last look at the valley below, at the cabin tucked into the fold of the earth, at the life she had built from the ruins of the mission. She smiled. It was a good map, the best she had ever made. And then she turned and walked into the future, a surveyor who had finally finished her work. She was the map lady, and the ground was solid. The institutional gears ground on, the world continued to change, and the fire continued to burn in distant places. But here, on the ridge in Montana, there was only the snow and the silence and the woman. She had done her part. She had held the ground, and that was enough. The last thing she saw before she went back into the cabin was a single golden eagle circling high above the valley. It was free, and so was she. Elena Vance closed her door and let the world go, a surveyor who had found her own way back to the center of the map. She was home, and she was at peace. The fire in the stove was low, the coals glowing a deep, steady red. She sat in her chair and watched the light fade, her mind finally quiet. She was the map lady, and she had held the ground. The snow fell through the night, covering the tracks she had made, erasing the path she had taken. It didn't matter. She knew where she was the foundation, and the foundation was strong. Elena Vance slept, her heart beating in time with the world. She was home, she was free, and the map was complete. The institutional reports were wrong. The truth was here in the quiet, snowy heart of Montana. She was the map lady, and the ground was solid. She didn't need to listen to the mountain anymore. She was listening to herself, and the message was clear. She had won. She had saved the men. She had saved the truth. She had saved herself. She was Elena Vance, and she was home. The final coordinate was found. The survey was done. The map was closed. And as the last of the light disappeared behind the peaks, the woman on the ridge finally let the world go. She was free. She was the foundation, and the foundation was strong. The silence was the only commendation she needed. She was the map lady, and she was home. The snow was deep, but her boots were heavy. She was a soldier of the earth, and the ground was solid. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the cabin pull her toward the only thing she had left to do. She slept, and in her dreams, the mountain was finally still. She was home. Elena sat by the small window of her cabin as the blue hour settled over the Gallatin Range, watching the light die out against the peaks until the world was nothing but shades of graphite and slate. Her shoulder didn't ache as much when it was cold, the low temperature acting as a natural compress against the jagged scar tissue that still felt like a foreign object beneath her skin. She had spent the afternoon clearing the heavy drifts from the porch, a slow and methodical labor that required her to find new ways to leverage her weight now that her left side didn't quite track with the right. There was no one there to tell her to take it easy, no medics to check her vitals, and no officers to monitor her progress. There was only the wind and the specific, hollow sound of the shovel hitting the wood. She went to the small desk in the corner and opened her logbook, but she didn't record seismic data or tectonic shifts tonight. She pulled out a small, worn photograph she had kept tucked in the back, not of a person, but of a specific ridgeline in the Sorobai, taken before the hangar had become a crater. She looked at the geometry of the rock, the way the limestone had folded over the eons, and then she struck a match. She watched the flame catch the edge of the paper, the chemical image curling and blackening as the heat consumed the memory of the place. She dropped the burning scrap into the ash tray and watched it turn into a gray ghost of itself. She didn't need the picture anymore. The map was burned into the back of her retinas, a permanent layer of her vision that she could never toggle off. The silence of the house was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that she had learned to wear with a certain grim comfort. In the military, silence was a warning, a sign of a perimeter breach or a radio failure. But here, it was the sound of her own autonomy. She walked to the window and pressed her forehead against the glass, feeling the bite of the Montana winter. Somewhere out there, the 3rd Battalion was sleeping in warm beds, and Miller was probably watching the stars over a beach in Oahu, and Gathers was staring at the cinder-block wall of a cell in Fort Leavenworth. The institution had moved on, its great, heavy gears already grinding toward a new mission, a new secret, a new disaster. But she was still here, the one who had stayed on the ground while the world shifted beneath them. She reached out and touched the window frame, her fingers finding the small, rhythmic vibration that still lived in the wood when the wind hit the ridge just right. She knew it wasn't the project. She knew it wasn't the weapon. It was just the world, moving the way it had always moved, indifferent to the maps and the metals and the small, fragile lives of the people who tried to measure it. She pulled her denim jacket tighter around her chest and looked toward the north, toward the dark, unmapped wilderness where the fire had finally gone out. The shadow of the mountain was long, but she wasn't standing in it anymore.